that was the part that
Well,
was
it's going now.
supposed to be
There,
aired.
it's going.
Yeah, that fortunately everything that preceded this recording has been fortuitously, um, um, prevented from
Yeah,
being recorded. So,
that's too bad.
all
I hit
right,
the
no,
30
that's
second
good.
countdown,
Yeah.
and
We had the whole redundant 30-second countdown.
yeah,
My stupid little jokes. All right,
it was because of the.
let's just get right into it.
All right, what are we getting into?
What are we getting into?
I don't know. Yeah.
Getting into everything, man.
All right. Is there anything specific on your mind? Last time we talked, we were talking about all the mysteries of the universe, as you normally do. And the Bhagavad Gita and my New Living Translation of it.
Yeah, we were talking about the Bhagavad Gita. That was kind of interesting. That was really interesting, actually. But last we spoke too, we were talking about the kind of the permissive and the positive wills of God, and
Oh,
how some understanding of that is arguably necessary for proper Bible interpretation. And then there's going to be a question about like, um, see, I mean, the way that I'm inclined to approach the question of like how to discern what God wills in and of itself versus what he merely allows as a means to an end is that basically God always wills life, order, regeneration, healing. And I'm sure you can find lots of verses to support that in the Old Testament, um, or the Hebrew Bible. Um,
there'll be none of
and
that here.
hmm,
There'll be none of that here.
no, this is not the place where such things are discussed. Um, uh, Now the thing about it is one is going to assume, like for example, in the New Testament it says that uh, the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. God is no light; in Him there's no darkness at all. And so one is going to, the way one wants to approach it, or at least the way that I want to approach it, is to assume that God's positive will is always toward healing, creation, regeneration, and that his permissive will is basically that God is behind everything, but whenever something bad is happening, that's when we're seeing his permissive will. And now the thing about it, though, is that other people are going to have an approach to it where it's kind of like they never really have an understanding of what God's positive will is beyond whatever it is that actually happens. And so, like, they have that high view of God's sovereignty where it's like uh, they'll look at whatever happens and say, well, that must have been the will of God. But there's kind of like a sense of like treating that as a direct end in itself. Like someone goes to hell forever, that must have been the direct will of God, um, in such a way that um, that person's damnation now seemingly becomes the positive will of God. So, in other words, there's not really any principal distinction we can draw between the positive and permissive wills of God, because at the end of the day, the positive will is just whatever happens. Um, and um, if something happens and is regarded as like sort of the final stage of the development of whatever process that it represents, then that's going to be interpreted as his positive will, no matter how negative a development that in fact was. And then it's like, again, we don't there doesn't seem to be any need to draw a distinction between what God wills and what he merely allows as a means to an end. Or at least, if there is such a distinction, we just never know where to draw it, because we never know what he actually desires as an end in itself. And so that's why I would say that probably the understanding that God himself never kills, steals, or destroys, that he himself, as far as his own agency, like if it happens through an angel or it happens through a godly person, that's God's agency. If it happens through Satan, if it happens through oh goodness, okay, I was wrong about when the hi. No, I don't even have until 1:30. Let me get out of here. Hold on just a second.
Hey, Jacob's in the comments.
Jacob's in the comments. All right, well,
Whoa.
maybe he can join.
You gotta stick around now. So is Hezi. They got on
Oh,
here.
Hezzy's in here?
Yeah,
Hezzy
he's
is
in the
high
comments.
level. I mean, so is Jacob, obviously, but I'm not trying to damn with Saint praise. But let me get into my room.
All right, get into your room. Like I'm gonna carry that from here. Hey, wait.
I'm gonna get into my room, but I bet
room.
you it's gonna lose the signal on this, and I'm gonna have to join on my phone, which is fine. But
okay. Well, I hope it's clean. As you can see, I've cleaned my room, like Jordan Peterson says. Like those stash of tattoo. So what Cal was saying, we've been bouncing back and forth in different chats. I'll just monologue here. And with in different chats like Signal app and things like that. And also Yosef has been kind of I've been in another chat with him, kind of going back and forth, kind of all relating to these same ideas. I'm not sure how to address Jacob's question. It's a good one. You always ask good questions. But one thing I think it was helping me thinking about the positive versus permissive will was the permissive will is something like almost like God leaving or creating space for something to come into creation, which almost allows for sin. I don't think it necessarily condones sin or missing the mark or something like that. And this is where I'm not sure if I'm going to explain this right, but if you have an identity of God, whatever that is something infinite, like a name of God, an identity that we're trying to be like, seeing that mark would be something like sin, but it would also allow for your identity to be distinguished. So it allows for diversity within like unification. So it's like God leaving is allowing for creation to happen, which would allow something that would look similar to a fall, because it's you're moving into your own identity, but then God coming back is bringing those things back into unity. I didn't get a chance to see the signal notes. What do you mean? Has he hop on here if you can? Well, you probably can't, can you? It's the Sabbath. It might be over for you. I gotta look at signal. What signal notes? I haven't got to look at the signal notes. Sorry about that. So hopefully Cal comes back because I'm not sure how to carry this. So, but Jacob asks, was the crucifixion the positive will? Hey, he's back. What's up? It's working.
yes, I don't. Okay, so he's asking, is the crucifixion the positive will? That's a really good question, because it's at some point there's always going to be that convergence where everything in context is the positive will. It says that he was delivered up by the deliberate foreknowledge of God, right? So it's suggesting that on some sense it's like it's not what should have happened, and yet of course it is, in another sense, it is the positive will. I'm trying to, I mean, I think like textbook, like you would say it's permissive, in the sense that
I would almost think it's positive.
It's not like God desires the suffering of Jesus as an end in itself.
Yeah.
So in that sense, one would say it's permissive. But I was trying to get into like this kind of more fundamental thing about whether whether the view that God's positive will is always toward life, healing, regeneration is necessary in order to have a usable sort of interpretive framework of, permissive versus positive will at all. Because if one can't ever really, if there's no basis on which one can really determine what God desires in and of itself, because sometimes he desires, violence and suffering and destruction in and of itself, hypothetically, and sometimes he desires life and good things and healing in and of themselves, hypothetically, then it seems like in practice, though there may in principle be a distinction between his permissive and positive wills, in practice we never really know where to draw the line interpretively. So that's kind of why that's part of why I tend to think the right way to approach that question of dividing the permissive and the positive will from each other is to assume that that God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all, and that it's Satan who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But of course, again, where everything is ultimately the will of God in some sense or another, then you can have God essentially doing things through Satan, like in the Hebrew Bible. I'm getting the books wrong, I think, but in Samuel it says that God moved David to do the census that was against God's will, and then in Chronicles or some other book it says Satan did it, or vice versa. But there's that idea that God might do things through Satan, and then there's really an ambiguity there, or a sort of double meaning there, where in a sense God didn't do it, because he didn't do it with his own agency. He didn't do it through an angel or through his de novo creative power. But so in that sense he didn't do it, but in another sense he does everything. Which book is it where he says, I am the Lord, I do good and I do evil, I create good, I create evil. Does destruction come to a city and I not will it? And the Hebrew Bible especially is really big on that. It's probably, more, not that I'm a scholar or anything, but as far as I can tell, the development of ideas there is maybe kind of once you get to Second Temple Judaism, you have more of this emphasis on Satan as you might say the left, at the very least the left hand of God, maybe even something more like a rogue agent. And you have more so God and Satan being opposed, whereas in Job, I mean they might sort of ambiguously be opposed, but one can there regard Satan as some kind of agent of God, maybe he's the executioner, or he's the prosecutor, something like that, right? So I don't know if I'm making any sense at all.
No, I think it makes sense to me. Jacob left another comment and said it's textbook permissive, which refutes Christianity entirety, which I'm not quite sure I understand. Where I would say it would seem to me like it's almost God's positive will, is because it's a unifying force that's happening on the cross, and that's where I would think it's almost. And maybe, but I don't know. I guess I would ask maybe the same question.
That's why I kind of preceded what I said by saying that there's going to be that point where taken in context, everything is, in a sense, it's positive will.
Yeah, kind of like the Joseph story or something, where he goes down to Egypt, and at the end he's
but if permissive will means anything, then it's sort of applied in those cases where, at least on the surface, one would not regard what happened as something that God desired in and of itself. Like God predestined Joseph to be sold into slavery. Now, presumably, that's not God's will for his people. But he was sold into slavery by his brothers. God predestined that. Presumably, that's not really God's heart. it's not really what he wants, but you know what he meant, what they meant for evil, God meant for good. So yes, he predestined it, but like as a means to Joseph's sort of triumphal revelation of himself to his brothers, and you know, rescue of his brothers from their predicament, kind of deal.
Yeah.
So in other words, it had a silver lining, the dark cloud, which was the point of the dark cloud kind of thing. But was I? Oh yeah, no. Well, yeah, no. So anyway, that's why when I kind of approach the question of the positive versus permissive wills, I have it from, I'm approaching it from that standpoint.
Yeah.
And I'm also approaching it from the standpoint of, you know, at least when you include the New Testament as part of the Bible, which I understand obviously not everyone on this channel does, then you are, but maybe also Judaism sees it this way too, or most of Judaism, that the good that God is regarding is the good of everyone. So there's a certain sense in which he means the election of Israel, so as to bring light to the Gentiles. And he has the good of the Gentiles in mind too. And you know, obviously that's the case in Jonah, right? Where Nineveh is not that's a Gentile city. His prophet doesn't want it to be saved, but you know, he tells Jonah, well, you were upset about the loss of a little tree or a little creeping thing, but this city has many men and animals. It's like, don't you think that's worth something too? And so I am looking at the positive will of God is that everyone should flourish, and you know, be happy and prosperous. So it's something that goes beyond Israel, something that ultimately transcends Israel as well, in that way. But yes. Anyway.
Well, I can just pause here. This is Shane. I guess he did join us, so he said he's a friend of Jacob's. How's it going?
Hey, how's it going, you guys?
Hey, what's up,
Good.
Shane?
Hey, yeah, my only question was like, after what I've been listening to is why isn't everybody flourishing if that is if that's what God wants,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I have my own thoughts about that, but I was wondering what you guys thought.
Yeah.
Now, why are you making me sin? It's the Sabbath.
Yeah, it's the Sabbath.
The Sabbath. I don't stream
What?
on the Sabbath. Why are you making me into a sinner?
I'm streaming. You want me to take it down?
No. It's
Cal's
like
been-
I love Cal so much, and
thank you.
He says like, you talk about the most important things, and I just couldn't sit here and not join.
Well, thank you.
Like, oh, you're talking about all the most important things. Why don't you come on my channel more often, Cal?
I've not recently begun to have free time until recently, which is a tautology. But
how old is the baby?
He's 2 and 4 months.
Mazel tov.
Thank you so much. And you know, the other thing is, technically, I don't even really have free time right now. Like, that's like, you're going to be breaking down my door with the interruptions.
Chezi says it's pikuach nefesh. It's for saving of human souls.
Yeah. The thing with Cal too,
you're allowed to break the Sabbath for pikuach nefesh. Okay.
I will say, can I say this before you start though?
Sure.
The thing with Cal too is I really appreciate about him. and I've known him for what, maybe a year now. We've talked, but he takes, like you said, he's really touching on these important questions. But he actually takes almost every question seriously, and will try to follow it to its end. And even when he's exploring a topic, he's actually like doing philosophy. He's actually wrestling with the toughest
You know,
questions.
what's the story of that I like, without ignoring Shane's question, which I'm going to get to.
Sure.
A story that I like of that is of Rabbi Hillel, where his two students placed a bet on whether one of them could make him angry. So they just continually went to his house whenever he was taking a bath and interrupted him. You know, whenever he was like half dressed, he had to come to the door. And then they would ask him like literally the dumbest questions they could think of. Like Master, why do he almost right? Like why do the Mesopotamians have square heads or something strange like that? And he just tries his best to give a good faith answer to each question. And I'm not sure it's explained in the anecdote or in the story whether he was wise to their game. One imagines because he's very wise that he was, but on another level, it kind of works better if he wasn't. He's just so good-hearted that
So, at the end of the anecdotes, the guy gets really mad and he says, "How dare you, Hillel? You cost me 100, whatever the coins were." And Hillel responds to him, "It's worth that you should lose 100 whatever 100 gold coins, and Hillel should not get mad."
What his continual refrain that made me brought up that story was, "My son, that's a very good question."
Yeah.
That's beautiful. God is truly in a statement like that. Anyway, but well, the question is, why is so? If God's positive will is that everyone should flourish, then why do we find that that's not what's happening? So just straight classical theodicy, and I'm not entirely sure I agree with it, or that I think it's a sufficient answer in and of itself. But the route that the apologists are always going to go with that is like, it was God's will. It is God's will that everyone flourish, but it's also His will that they have freedom to potentially act other than how He wants them to act. Given that, then to the extent that we have any problems at all, it's all our damn fault. And how dare one suggest that God should carry any of the blame? And that's all well and good. But if you're gonna apply that approach to, like, let's say the evangelical Christian understanding, maybe even like fundamentalist Jewish understanding of how sin originated, where there was Adam and Eve, they were in the garden. There was a tree with a fruit that they weren't supposed to eat, and in some sense, before they ate it, one assumes there was a sense in which they didn't quite know good from evil. Well, right from wrong, maybe. Good from evil, presumably, because the fruit is the tree of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But they eat it, and that's how sin and death come into the world. And then, so it reminds you of sort of the Gary Larson Fireside cartoon of like, there's a passenger on an airplane and he's fumbling for the recline button on his seat, but he inadvertently flips there's another switch that's labeled "wings stay on" / "wings fall off." So in fumbling for the recline button, he inadvertently triggers the "wings fall off" switch, and it's all his damn fault. And at some point, one just raises the question of if it was so important, so all-consumingly important, so life and death important, that sin not enter the world, then why, so to speak, was the "wings stay on, wings fall off" button placed so close to the recline button? Why was that tree planted in a garden and it wasn't like supervised by cherubim yet, or and there wasn't anyone working harder to keep smooth talking snakes out of the garden, and so the thing is, one begins to wonder, because and this obviously gets hard. See, the thing is, I'm not sharp anymore at this hour of the day. But if you give me enough time, I can try to lay out more so what my thoughts are. But in the meantime, I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
So I was thinking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil this morning, and I was like, wow, I wonder if when they tasted it, how I wonder how good it tasted, like imagining just if I had never had, like, every apple that I've had was delicious, and it's like, so just using, I know it probably wasn't an apple, but like just had they not eaten of the like, when you're hungry, everything tastes good. And it's like when they ate it, it probably tasted good, but they were like, everything tastes good when you're hungry. And then it's like, oh, not only does it taste the same as everything else, but we broke the one commandment that God gave us, and now we did it for something that was the same as everything else. And that, so it's either it's either, in my mind, that they did something and they lost the only thing they had, which was the principle of having obeyed,
right,
for practically something that was the same as everything else.
Right.
Or it tasted so good, but then they realized, oh, it doesn't taste so good because we didn't obey our Creator, and the guilt, like, how smoker's guilt or guilt of doing something will kill you faster than the actual thing itself. And it's like, so those were two ideas. And then there is okay, it just tasted good and now we have to pay for it, and so does, and then it's like, wow, like their senses were activated, and then it's like, wow, you look good. Oh, I'm like, now we got to go work for this goodness, I guess. Like the goodness that wasn't of God, but now the goodness that we thought was good, we have to work for it, and maybe someday the goodness of before will come back if we work hard enough.
Yeah, No, go ahead.
And you have pains in childbirth. Like those are the two things we got to do now. Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about that. Like there's something, I don't know, like the positive will. I haven't heard that term, but
I know I didn't come up with it, but I don't know where I got it from. But I know it's I think it's fairly standard somewhere. But
it is. Yeah. I don't know where. So the time you came on my channel was probably one of the best discussions I've ever had on my channel. And we talked a lot about that. I love you, Jason, but Cal's like this guru.
I'm right here.
Corner, and you're just a friend of mine. It's like familiarity.
That's crazy because among all my friends, we see Jason more as the guru, and I'm just some kind of, I'm some kind of philosopher Mon K, like someone with pretensions to logic chopping, but with no actual credentials. I'm really slow and muddled and stupid a lot of the time, but thank you, Jacob.
I'm not sure if this makes any sense, but I think of Jason as like a Baptist saint, and I think of you as a like Indian guru.
Ha! Well, that's maybe not too. I mean, the thing is, I was raised in an Indian religion. There's going to be that like Jason and I were talking about Bhagavad Gita. And you saw I can scan and break that Sanskrit verse. That's there's some kind of something that rubbed off on me. But anyway.
Okay, so Father Stephen mentioned something that's been breaking my mind ever since he mentioned it, which is, so he pointed out, so you know that verse, I don't know where it's from, it's somewhere in the writings of Paul. He who knew no sin became a sin offering for us, right? And I didn't understand that verse at all until Father Stephen translated it into Hebrew. And it's like this incredible pun. Because there's this concept of a chet, which in Hebrew there are different types of sin, right? So there's chet, which is the archery term that says like missing the mark, right? And there's other types like asham, and so which is usually translated as the guilt offering. So there's the sin offering and there's the guilt offering, and then there are the types of sins you can't bring sacrifices for at all. Okay, and the sin of the tree is referred to as a chet, as sin in terms of inadvertent sin. And there's even this idea that after the Messiah comes, there will still be inadvertent sin, right? And like inadvertent sin seems to be the permissive as opposed to the active will of human beings, which in a sense, I would say, reveals the active will of God as opposed to the permissive will of God. Like, Ratzon will has to reside in one or the other. It has to reside either in God or in man. And if it resides in, so when it comes to the will, when it comes to the sin of the tree, and I'm still working this out. When it comes to the sin of the tree, I think, in a sense, and like when you said it was predestined, I said sin is never predestined. And that's what got me thinking about this, because I think our failures to live up to God's infinite standards, that's not just God's permissive will, that's God's active will, because he made us finite. Right?
Yes, that's 100% correct, because his will was that there be some will other than his own, and so, you know, if we were not even sinning inadvertently but only doing his own, let's say his own active will, then there couldn't be a will that was distinguished from his active will. But your inadvertent sin is this kind of sin that in a sense you've already repented for because you didn't mean to do it in the first place. But now it's raising the question of whether, because so predestination and whether sin is ever predestined, this is really good. I think a lot increasingly in terms of this asymmetry. And I've even been going as far as to try to conceive of metaphysical models of time and so forth, whatever's beyond time. Because time is funny. Like on some level, we kind of idealize it as like the fourth dimension of like the space-time continuum. But then there also seems to be like this sort of time over which we're even like measuring like time, and like it seems like there's more to time than that. And it kind of seems like, you know, with like relativity and simultaneity or relativity of simultaneity, it seems like there's not really like anything like a global present. It seems like sometimes it looks like past and present and future are equally real, but at the same time it kind of seems like there's directedness to time, and it's like maybe there's more going on with time than space-time. Anyway, whatever, that's a digression. But I'm increasingly thinking that in this moment, there is something undecided, or if you will, superpositional about this moment, where really, it could go either way, what you're going to do. But as far as after it happens, there has to be a determinacy to what happens, such that there is no longer a metaphysical like a causality, like some causal debt that no one's picking up. Because like if I say something is 80% causally accounted for, there's factors that are making it 80% likely, but I just leave it at that as a matter of like my final metaphysical analysis. That remaining 20% is kind of like it's a causality. You might even see the phenomenon itself, like per impossibly or whatever, as like a kind of like itself a superposition. It's 80% this and 20% not this, and it's almost like destroying. It's like as a visible contradiction. It's like destroying your eye to even look at it. But that's obviously not what it is. One imagines that there, for the principle of sufficient reason to be in effect, a phenomenon has to always be 100% accounted for. So what I'm suggesting is that in the moment, it's free, but after the fact, it is determinate. It's decided, and
I think I'm back in my seat.
And I mean, there's something kind of intuitive about this too. Maybe I'll just leave it there for now, because when I'm coming to sin in the moment, like I would say that, see, right now at this point in time, I would say Adam was predestined to eat the fruit. But if he were here now, like in his sort of Edenic state of original ignorance slash bliss slash maybe even perfection, I would say he's free to either eat it or not. And so the question is, like, if there's any actual sin, what is the cause of that sin? I tend to be sort of like what they would call an ethical intellectualist, where if there's some objectively right answer to a decision, like not sin is objectively right, goodness is objectively right, then there's some way that means that the failure to choose the right option stems from a lack of whatever is needed to discern, whatever faculty. You can call it intellect, you can call it will, maybe you can see some way that those two are always interdefined on each other. But you would say that the objective rightness of the right answer means that any failure to choose the right answer stems from a lack of the faculty that's necessary to apprehend the right answer. And Adam, it says he saw the fruit was good to eat. So he saw that something not good was good. There was a judgment that he made that where he mistook, on some ultimate level, it looks, he mistook something evil for the good. And so it's like, what is the cause of sin? It's like maybe like asking, what is the cause of darkness? Darkness as such is not a thing such that it has a cause. So we would say the most we can say is the cause of darkness is the absence of light. I
disagree with that.
Okay.
Because in and you referred to it in Isaiah, and this is a theological assertion of at least Hasidic Judaism, is that God creates darkness, that darkness has a creation, right? God, and I mean, I was going to get to this, but so you have Seder Hishtalshalut and Tzimtzum, right? You have the order by which the darkness is created as God constricts himself and removes himself from that place where he was, right? And that is a chain of constrictions after constriction, where and frankly, I think the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil has to be one link in that chain, in that you're absolutely right. Before they ate of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, there was no possibility for them to deliberately sin, because they did not know good and evil, right? So at that level, it had to be an inadvertent sin. And yes, Mitch, sin is never predestined, but I have to say, I think that only refers to Zadon. That is only referred to transgressions, is how they're translated in the Bible. And I don't think that, so there's Chet, Asham, and Avon. And Chet, weirdly, Chet is also used for cleansing, right? And that's where that pun in "He who knew no sin became a sin offering for us." Like in Hebrew, it's a mind blowing pun. And when
Yeah,
Father
can you expand
Stephen,
on this?
I'm not sure I can, because
Okay.
like when you're reading through the Torah, right? There are many places where it refers to as chet, right?
Mhm.
Which is this weird word in Hebrew. So Hebrew words can have 2 or 3 letter roots. Generally, they have 3-letter roots. And the weird thing with chet is it has 3 letters, but one of them is silent. And usually, when you have like aleph as one of the 3 roots, like it gets conjugated, but for some reason, chet doesn't. Like the aleph is just there, which, I mean, aleph in a sense represents God. The aleph is there, but it doesn't get conjugated, which is like itself mind blowing. So this word chet it's just a really strange word, and in many places it's used to refer to inadvertent sin. In at least one place in the Bible, it's clearly an archery term to miss the mark, and in some places it actually refers to cleansing, like the Mei Chatat. It is translated as the waters of cleansing, but it literally means the waters of sin.
So I have a question regarding that. So if this word you're saying het is kind of like the missing the mark, we would say, and you're saying God's name is in that, but it's not pronounced. Is that correct?
The aleph is in there, but it's not pronounced. Yeah, and it doesn't.
That makes sense to what you were saying about God creating darkness. Like he's always there in the darkness, but he's not there. Like he's not.
I have some questions that are directly connected to that, because I want to see if this is more so a semantic difference or if this is a really thoroughgoing substantive metaphysical difference. So, like and Jacob, I'm sure you know this, that most, probably all of the Christian tradition has this model of sin where it's a, Augustine called it a privatio boni. It's like the absence of good. So it's like metaphysically, it's not really itself like a positive anything. It's just the absence of the good. But there's obviously been different conceptions of good and evil. Like, Jung was, he was obviously raised in a Christian culture, but he had a conception of evil where it's always something, it was another force that's opposite to good. And obviously Zoroastrianism has a notion of a struggle between 2 opposite, if not necessarily equal forces, good and evil. And so what I'm wondering is the Hasidic Jewish conception, is it like one? Is it like the other? Is it complicated, or what's going on?
I mean, it is somewhat complicated because there is this idea of constriction and God removing himself in order to create the darkness. But at the same time, there is a reality to the there's a reality to God, like God creates darkness, right? Maybe I should pull up that verse.
I think I know what you're talking about too. That he is the cause of darkness. Unless
this is
again, unless we're getting into like some kind of understanding of the permissive and positive will distinction in which he causes something by just not being there, by not doing something. Like in the narrative of the Exodus, or I mean a little bit before it talks about how the midwives caused the children to live, something like that, but it didn't, like all they did was prevent them from being, sometimes you can do something by not doing something.
So so we actually,
Yeah,
I mean, we
formed
spend
the light and created
very,
darkness.
yeah. So it's Isaiah 45:7. It says Yotzer or uvorechoshen, right? And it says I create darkness, and that word is the word for creating, creating out of ex nihilo.
To
Is
create
like
something out of nothing. That's
out of,
amazing.
yeah. It's like it's actual creation, and
Yes.
like it says that, right? So yeah.
That's amazing. Do you think
No.
that the Jewish metaphysical understanding of sin and goodness is a dualist understanding, like metaphysically, or do you still think that there's something there where ultimately sin is regarded as an expression of lacking something?
Well, okay, so it's dualist, I would say, in the manner that it's dualist in the manner that we in Judaism we have binaries which are real, and they combine. So when you talk about the problem of the one and the many, right? And Christians talk about the one and the three, as opposed in what I have pointed out is no. In Judaism, we would say there's one and the many. There's one and the two, one and the three, one and the four, one and the five, one and the six, and there is a form of dualism where there's light and darkness, good and evil, right? And that doesn't mean they are in any sense equivalent, but it means that the combination of the two or the three or the four or the five are a reflection of the one, if that makes any sense.
It has to be like that, and sorry, unless someone else was going to jump in.
I was just going to state a quote I heard that, like the one and the many, I thought that was a like I thought its originator was like the Platonists.
It's been so it's a philosophical question just as old as time. Like everyone's going to have taken a stab at it. You know what I'm saying? But I'm sure the Platonists are probably, maybe at least certainly in Western philosophy, they're the starting place, for that. I'm sure.
Yeah, Nietzsche called Christianity Platonism for the people.
Okay.
The Bible itself has this interplay between the one and the many.
Right.
And so I would say the question is as old as the Bible.
You said that there's a way that the many are reflecting the one, and
the
so
many always reflects the one. Yes.
Right. And so there's a way that it's almost like you can start out with this conception of like one simpliciter, and then to really set it off, you have like manyness or multiplicity. And then, but it then somehow in the juxtaposition of these two things, it's like it's reflecting the one. What it reminds me of is I'm because if one tries to do some kind of half-assed amateur metaphysics of ultimate reality, one is trying to look at one is trying to conceive of something like a self-relativization. It's, something which is one term that has a sort of self-duality, that can in effect function as its own negation or complement, and yet still be one, and paradoxically just be one, in insofar as it's functioning as its own opposite. And so if one is saying that what this kind of unifying term is the light, then what one is looking at is like, I think of Jesus' words when he says, if the light that is in you is darkness, then how great is the darkness? So one is here conceiving perhaps of light that is so much greater than other light as to not only like make it be darkness in comparison, but maybe even on some ontological level, it makes it darkness. And the light that is in you is darkness, then how great is the darkness? And yet, one is still looking for like the kind of the unifying level of analysis or reality where it's all light. And I mean, it does.
Okay, so can you have light without darkness?
That's the important question. So on a certain, so the answer that I want to say is, maybe this is not helpful at all, but one would say the finite is not the infinite. One could say the infinite is the finite. So there's whenever you're doing your kind of your predicate logic, if you're going to do your identification, that means there's going to be a sort of exclusion that has to be in effect. Like there's an exclusion criterion. If everything is right, then we can't talk about right. If everything is light, then we can't talk about light. You know, that's kind of what would be your starting place. So in order for there to be light, there has to be darkness. And yet one is wondering if there's a sort of, say there's two valued logic over here, and on some level it is presupposing the distinction between X and not X is presupposing, this is Christopher Langan, presupposing a more fundamental medium that has essentially, it's generic enough to be instantiated in both, but we're already so generic here that we're at, X or not X is the principle of non-contradiction. This is like as generic as it gets. So the only thing more fundamental than this that can be in the nature of both X and not X is the absolute, both X and not X itself. So like there's two valued logic on the one side and then a sort of one valued logic on the other, where on the one side you do need darkness in order to have light. On the other, you don't. It's one could say that light is that which doesn't need darkness in order to exist. I think Christian metaphysics, you kind of see this like sort of this notion of an uncreated light, but it feels like Shane wants to say something.
So I think that what you just said is the man who will only, it says he will only know his own name, correct? Is what it says in the Bible about the second coming of Christ. And I think that so one reason I think that light takes oh gosh, for lack of a better word, like is better, well, is because that there would be no light without darkness, but there would be no anything without light. Do you know, like the darkness wouldn't even exist if you didn't have like, would you even have eyes if there were no light? Like if you don't, I don't know. So, but I think that medium, that that generic thing that you were talking about, I think that is on the cosmic scale, on the like largest possible front, that I think is he who will come to judge the living and the dead. And I think it's the light, like it's the one element that is generic and fundamental, and it's on the side of the light. And I think like we're figuring out on different levels, on the physical level first, like, okay, light is superior, and then all this evidence will build up, and then it'll just be a matter of like, then free will, then free choice will have its actual, you will have an obvious choice because you have all the evidence that the light is the way and the truth, and it'll be literally just a choice. Like I choose, you know, him over over the many, over all this other stuff. And I think it like that's why free will is so important.
And that's kind of like, I mean, that's making me think of like the, you know, like I think of like Isaiah, where it talks about like the waters will, I mean, peace will cover the earth like the waters cover the sea.
Knowledge will cover the earth.
Knowledge. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to let other people respond to that.
Well, I mean, I could kind of go on a rant here, but I don't know if this will be helpful at all.
Shit.
So in sorry. Oh. But so in talking to Yosef recently, I feel like, well, talking to him and you, Cal, both kind of separately, not in the same conversation, I feel like it's kind of caused me to really stretch my thinking, which I don't even know how to way to describe it other than it makes me feel like it's kind of led to maybe, I don't know if it's a step up, but there's this, because I was talking to him when I made that video about the Trinity, and I was kind of framing it as like something like I was saying this Holy Spirit is something like the spirit of forgiveness, and I didn't want to single it down to that because it's kind of like a unifying force. It's whatever between the two. So you have X and not X, and it's like that holds X and not X together. It's God, but it also and this is when Yosef was like, you know, you have this idea of the Trinity, and it's often framed in our minds as like creator, creation, and then Holy Spirit, or the thing that brings them together. So it is very divided, and Yosef was trying to get me to the point where he was saying, you know, God is like even above that, at a higher level than that. And so whatever is God, and I was like, well, now like it's something ineffable. It is like the tetragrammaton. You can't actually say it because it's something that gives space to creator and creation, both. It gives something to, it allows for X and not X to exist. And I don't know that there is a right way. Like, I don't think you can get a language around it, whatever that is. But I was thinking maybe something more closer to the mark would be something like a life, or the life-giving spirit, which would allow in that when you say God steps away or he removes himself, it allows for creation, it allows for something to come into being. So it almost allows for the fall. But then that God coming back is that force, like you were talking about, that is almost forceful in the end of all things, and it's bringing everything back together.
Yeah, that's super.
Like what holds light and darkness together? Like it's what gives life to darkness, I guess you could say. Like this is something that gives life to darkness, and it gives life to good, it gives life to evil. I mean, as those things are to say, even for me, it's like it's stretching me to a point where I'm like, okay, here's what, and this is a little bit helpful for me, and maybe this might be helpful for other people. I'll invoke the movie The Sandlot. So I don't know if you guys have seen that, but there's this part. Have you guys seen The Sandlot? Okay, well, it's a movie, and it's about a kid, and it's freaking phenomenal movie, one of the best movies ever made. But he's kind of this nerd, and he just plays with his Tinker Toys in his room, and these other neighborhood kids are playing baseball, and he's kind of like rejected by society, but he's kind of like in this walled garden, something, you know, kind of in this secure home place, but he's kind of bored. There's this line where his mom comes to him, and his mom says, like, what are you doing? Like, get out, go out into the field, like, go out, make friends, get into trouble. And so it's kind of like giving him space, right? She's removing herself from this situation, allowing him to fall, but in that, allowing him to find his own identity. And so I'm not even sure if I'm describing it. This is what I feel like is what is happening. It's just kind of like a breathing out and a breathing in, and it's allowing for creation to come into being. But as soon as that creation comes in, that creates diversity, and then it pulls it back together. And it's like breathing out and breathing in. God, I don't know how to describe it necessarily. That's how it feels to me, which sounds also like, you know, like just like giving birth, like even the most immediate sense. But even something Jacob was saying too, it reminded me of, gosh, I don't even know if this is the right way to describe it, if this will be helpful at all. But my friend Cody earlier wrote this song that stood out to me a lot. It's the lyrics that says, "Which direction is home? Is it in me? Does that make me alone? Which way are you going to go? Further out or further down the rabbit hole? Which place do you belong? To your family blood or to the freedom you found? What's the words to your song? Seems like once you write it down, you can sing it and move on. And then this last part. Seems like we're made to separate and belong. Walking down a staircase in circles. Seems like we're made to separate and belong. And so that line just really stood out to me a lot. It seems like that's kind of what God is allowing for you to separate, and then he's making you belong. And so in that is the act. And whatever that is allowing for you to separate is something like missing the mark or sin. And it's not necessarily like a different, like the kind of sin we think of that sends you to hell or something. But it's just this kind of sin that allows for you to come into being as your own identity, because you're separating. And then you have to come back and belong. And it's through that. That's what I was kind of describing as like forgiveness seems like it's kind of pulling things back together. But I think it's more than that. That's what I was saying. I think it's whatever we're describing as the Holy Spirit is more than that. Which I think that's why it's probably left best at the language of just Holy Spirit, because there's, as soon as you try to get words around it, it's like you fail or miss the mark or something. Does that even make any sense? I don't know.
It makes lots of sense. It's just hard to talk about the correspondences, because what I'm hearing in you is, see, what I could have done earlier is I could have, instead of using light, I could have talked about, or the one, I could have talked about the infinite. So I could have had like the infinite as a concept. Well, unless we have the finite, we can't talk about the infinite. So I have to set it off against the infinite. But then I sort of realized that the thing that is more fundamental than both the infinite and the finite, such as to even enable their comparison and their differentiation within something more fundamental, that must be the true infinite, and so on. But see, now once I pull that up, I'm setting it off in distinction to whatever false infinite I had before. So what I have is something, I have a conception of the infinite, as it were, like as a dynamic alternation. And that's obviously like process theism is like, it's an instinct, it's a movement in theology, it's an impulse, and it's been happening. And but the other side of that is a kind of like atemporal, sort of static classical theism that says anything that was changing would not be God. And then obviously you've got all different philosophical and theological sort of instincts and answers in response to that kind of tension, or what itself appears to be another sort of tension or duality. But what you were talking about was extremely beautiful, as far as the woman withdrawing herself from the boy so that he can individuate and be who he is. And of course, that's the Kabbalistic conception of creation, is actually a withdrawal. And that's incredibly interesting too. So what one has here is almost like a kind of it is a continual shattering or coming apart for the sake, which is allowed for the sake of some more unified integration, that one imagines. If one is supposing God is absolutely sovereign and there's no way, he doesn't waste any motion. It's like sort of perfect economy of motion as an artist. Then one imagines that greater unity could not have come about except as the result of such like disintegration or shattering. But see, then that we're getting into the question of like, see, now it's like asking whether Adam had to sin, and he was predestined to sin. And so like there's a line from George MacDonald that I like a lot, that I told you about, Jason, where George MacDonald's protagonist in one of his stories is told some piece of advice, which, if he remembers in a difficult situation that he's going to encounter in the future, put him in good stead. And he says, well, what if the time comes and I forget this very important advice? And then the crow, I think it is, whatever character is giving him the advice, says, if the time comes and you forget, then some evil that is good for you will follow. And he says, well, that sounds good. So when the time comes, maybe I should forget. What happens if I remember? And he says, then if you remember, then some evil that is not good for you will not follow. So there's this kind of weird either-handed nature of the infinite, which when I mean the way that I'm increasingly finding it potentially useful to think about is, if it happened, we must say that it had to happen, because otherwise we have a failure to explain something. But if it's still ongoing, it's free in the nature of a superposition, which it's something like once the superposition collapses, it's retroactively determined never to have been a superposition at all, something like that. It's really weird like this. It's truly
it can also be a split.
A split.
So there is this idea that whenever a superposition collapses, there's multiple universes that follow from it. One in which it
I've heard of that.
one way and one in the
Yeah.
I kind of want to go back to something you said, which I'm glad you said it before. I think I was thinking the same thing, and that's what I'm going to say, is that we're talking about things that make a lot of sense, that at the same time, I'm not sure that we're coherently and methodically explaining them. Like, I am not sure that I have a good way of actually following this conversation from A to B to C, and explaining what we're talking about. Certainly, if somebody is listening and they're having trouble following us, at the same time, I feel like what we are saying are many relevant things that are necessary to be considered together, which is why whenever I talk to you, I have to spend a lot of time thinking about it, and it's not like I've spoken to you so many times. But one thing I wanted to point out, and I hope it's relevant to me, it seems very relevant, is so in Genesis it says that God saw that it was very good, and the rabbis ask, well, what does it mean to be very good? And they say, very good, that is the evil inclination, that is sin, that is evil. Because like you were saying, you have light, which in a sense includes in itself darkness, or infinity, which includes in itself the finite.
Yeah.
And the very good is good, which, so
I think I know where you're going with this.
I go back to the verse. I saw greater is wisdom from folly than as light is from darkness.
Yeah.
And the Hasidic masters explain the greatness of the light is from the darkness, in that through having experienced the darkness is when you have an appreciation of the greatness of the light. And that's wisdom over folly, right? So if God's will shall be done regardless, and God's will shall be done regardless, so why is it necessary to have wisdom over folly? Why is it better to have to choose God's will and do God's will? The same result will happen even if I sin, but the difference there is Trey's like, what? But it's the greatness of light over darkness and wisdom over folly, to choose good over evil, because even evil God will turn to good. But the beauty of good is that it is direct. It is God's face, not God's back. and we want to see God's face, not God's back. But wherever you look, you will see God because God is everywhere.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Good.
In some senses, some ways you're looking at God's face, and in some places you're looking at God's back.
100%.
Unfortunately, as human beings, we are not capable of seeing God's face except in retrospect.
Whoa. That might need to be explained to me more.
So Moses asks God to see his face, right?
Okay.
And God says, "You cannot see my face, for it is impossible to see my face and live.
Right.
But I will let you see my back."
Mm-hmm.
And God passes by Moses, and Moses is able to see God's back, right? So if we know what will be, if we understand, you want me to pull up that article? It is a good one. You know what? When I'll let Cal speak after I explain this, and I'll pull up the article because
I don't necessarily have a lot to say in response to that. I'm just really interested. Actually, I probably do, but I'm just interested.
So, like, if we know how God will use things, right? And actually, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said this about theodicy. If we understood that the evil in our lives are ultimately for the good, then they would not be painful, right? It is only painful because we don't understand it. So, and so that's an integral part of it, right? If I knew that my suffering, right, is indeed for the good, then I wouldn't suffer because I would realize that it is a good sacrifice, right?
You would suffer. Is that what you said?
I would not suffer because if you know that the pain that you're going through is necessary, and you understand why it's necessary.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It would
then it wouldn't be painful.
Yeah.
I mean, you would be able to withstand that pain. Whereas it's the fact that you cannot understand and you do not know why that pain is necessary, which makes it so painful.
Yeah. There's something you said, and this is probably going to be very Christian-esque, I guess, that I'll go with. But, you know, God says, you cannot see my face and live. And so I would suggest that is the case. And then in order to see his face means you have to die, which is suffering on like multiple levels, I guess, in some way you could say. And it's a death to your own ego. Though I'm trying to think of, while you're talking, I'm like, I keep trying to like just point this to family to make it more understandable if I can. And the only way I could think of describing it is like, and this is maybe getting into weird, like, you could maybe make a case, oh, Jason, you might be thinking too much like Trinitarian still or something. But I guess I'm thinking like that is the most immediate experience I have that God gave me is family, like mother, father, and child. And so if I'm thinking the father and how the father face, the only way the father can see his face, his actual living face, is something like dying to himself, because the two become one flesh. So you have this, your child looks like you, but he also doesn't look like you. Does that make sense at all what I'm saying? So it does. It's a living face, but it is your face, it is your image, but it's not your image as well. And there has to be a negation, almost like a negation of yourself or a death of yourself in order to see your face living. Otherwise you could look in a mirror and it's like your face is just trapped there and you become a narcissist. I feel like I'm not being very clear in my language.
The Hegelian scholar, the Hegelian scholar George Van Riet he explained the Trinity as follows. He says it means there is otherness. He says the Trinity means that there's affirmation, negation, and then the negation of the negation, so that there's otherness in God, but it is also overcome in God. And what I'm seeing in this is similar. Like, I don't know, it's kind of like what I want to bring about something that is in the image of me on some level, because like that's what I call good. Like when God creates, he looks at it. He creates us in his image, and he calls it good. And so it's like, I
Yeah.
want to create something that is in my image and it's good. And then like in my case, my son Benjamin, he doesn't look like me. But where good means being in the image of me, he is so good that I mean, in my, like, I would say he actually looks more like me than I do, or something like that.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like suffering at all. Like, because like for you to look at him, it's not like, oh, this is a suffering of myself because he doesn't look exactly like me. You almost joy in the fact that he doesn't look exactly like you. That, I guess what I was getting at too is like the seeing the face of God. And this is what had kind of changed a lot of my theology a bit too, is this part in Genesis. And it's when Joseph goes down, he goes to Egypt and everything, and then he says, come back with your brother Benjamin. So they go back to Joseph, and Joseph decides to keep Benjamin. And they say to him, it's Judah. Judah is the one that says, like, well, I need to stay instead of my brother. But he says this line at the end. He says, for your sake be assured for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. This is the part. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father? So I think, and it's talking about seeing faces in this whole part. For we may not see the man's face unless our younger brother is with us. And then it goes into 46, and it says, I will go down with you to Egypt, and I'll bring you up, and Joseph shall put his hand on your eyes. I'm sorry, that's not all incredibly clear because I'll try to describe it more. There's an idea where, God made man in his image, so the only way to see God's full face is to see Adam, like the collective human, like all people. And that takes, like, not everybody looks like you, so that takes, like, you can't live.
Does this at all remind you? Does this at all connect to when Jacob sees Esau and he says, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God"?
Yeah. Because it's that act of reconciliation between brothers. Like, I don't think if God made man in His image, and that is Adam, a collective body of humanity, then what do we do with Cain? Like, what do we do with Cain? Like, do you just? I mean, obviously, you could say, like Jacob says, God allows him to kill Abel in hopes that he would repent, and so it's like that. It takes that repentance and that coming back together. I think before you see face to face, and then you see God's face, and He says, "I see your face like I've seen the face of God." But that is a death to self. Like in the act of forgiveness and repentance, both are dying a little bit, suffering a little bit to their own ego, in a way, and it takes that to see the face of God.
So this article is one of my favorites, even if it is from Rob Cook. God have mercy on the soul. I'm kind of joking, kind of not. Not one of my favorite rabbis, but Moses' vision. One of the more enigmatic. Did I pull this up on the thing? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
One of the more enigmatic passages in the Torah describes a mysterious encounter that took place following the sin of the golden calf. After successfully pleading on behalf of the Jewish people, Moses took advantage of the special time of divine favor. Please let me have a vision of your glory. God replied with that it is impossible for mortal man to have a vision of me and live. However, God agreed to protect Moses in the mountain crevice as he passed by. You will then have a vision of my back. My face, however, will not be seen. Exodus 33:17-23. This account raises many questions. The most obvious problem concerns the story's anthropomorphic elements. God has no body. What do the allegorical terms back and face mean? The Talmudic commentary for this puzzling incident only adds to our confusion. The sages explained that God revealed his back to Moses by showing him the knot of God's tefillah shel rosh. The tefillah shel rosh, the phylactery worn on the head, is held in place by means of a leather strap tied to the back of the head with a special knot. What is the significance of God's tefillin knot? Why does God choose to reveal that particular part of his tefillin to Moses. Knowing God. There are two levels of knowledge. The first is an accurate knowledge of an object's true nature. The second is a limited knowledge, restricted by our intellectual or physical limitations. Regarding tangible objects, there may not be a significant difference between the two levels of knowledge. But when dealing with abstract concepts, especially with regard to the nature of God, the difference will be great, perhaps infinitely so. The Torah is based on the second type of knowledge. It presents us with a perception of God according to our limited grasp, since only this type of knowledge can provide ethical guidance. Knowledge of God's true nature, on the other hand, is not a form of comprehension at all. As God informed Moses, man cannot have a vision of me and live, bound to the human intellect. Now we may begin to understand the metaphor of God's tefillin. Contained inside tefillin are scrolls with verses declaring God's unity and divine nature. These verses signify a comprehension of God's true reality. This truth, however, is beyond human understanding. How can we relate to this infinite truth? What brings it down to the level of our intellectual capabilities, enabling the knowledge to enlighten us and provide moral direction? The function of the tefillin is to bind the tefillah shel rosh, of the knot, is to bind the tefillah shel rosh to the head and intellect. The knot symbolizes a level of comprehension that takes into account the abilities of those contemplating, so that they may grasp and utilize this knowledge. The imagery of God's face and back corresponds to these two levels of knowledge. Face in Hebrew is panim, similar to the word pnim, meaning inner essence. True knowledge of God's infinite reality is God's face. Knowledge of God's reality, according to our limited understanding, on the other hand, is referred to as God's back. Moses was granted this partial, indirect knowledge, a grasp of the divine that we are able to appreciate and apply in our world. So, in essence, like, you have the tefillin that have an expression of God's inner sense, but you wear it and it's bound by these leather straps to you, right? It's in a sense, it's external to you, but it connects you to it, right? And so our understanding of God is I almost want to say ephemeral. It's something that is not intrinsic and perfect. It's not internal. It's something that is outside and cursory.
Well, what I got when I was reading that article was, because you're seeing the knot, and what I was thinking of almost is like, if you could see what it is that ties my back to my face, or something like that in virtue of which my back and face are unified, or that in virtue of which my left and right hands are unified, then you would be seeing my face. But see, then the thing is, and so in a way, by showing his back, he is showing his face. And so the thing about it is that if I'm giving an account of his face, that if God is giving an account of his face, that's in so doing, it's using a word to define a word. He says, my face is whatever is tying my back to my face. Then it is not explaining anything in some sense, because it's what would call it ignotum per ignotius, or obscurum per obscurius. It's the unknown in terms of the unknown. And but the infinite, in some way, I understand it as necessarily, is like, its definition is that it is the interplay between the finite and the infinite. And so that it in a similar way, it uses a word to define a word, indeed has to, because as the ultimate reality, it's not able to explain itself in terms of anything more fundamental than itself. So it's not able to explain itself in terms of anything other than itself. But anyway, that was my reaction to that article as I read it. I'm not sure necessarily the right understanding, interpretation, but
no, I really like it. Yeah. So weird question. I hope it's related. I think it's related. If Adam had the capacity to sin in the garden, but he didn't, would we have known that he had the capacity to sin?
oh, that is so good. I think about that all the time. I think about there's different ways to pose it because there's all different little things you can do with the modal operators, but basically it's like and Augustine had a cool riff on this, like kind of like how, you know, I know you probably don't think much of like the metaphysics of Augustine, but he was talking about how they were free to either sin or not sin. We are not free to not sin, and then, you know, in the future we will not be free to not sin. We will not be free to not sin, something like that.
Not be free to sin.
Yeah, not be free to sin, exactly. And so what I think about that is, what is, if you say that there's some unrealized potential, some people have the intuition that unless it becomes actual at some point, it can't be real. And then you can ask something like, well, I don't think you could ask like, what is a potential which is like unrealizable in principle, because then it wouldn't even be a potential. I think the question is like, what is the metaphysical status of a potential that is like, gosh, you see, the mind always wants to collapse it into one state or another. It's either it gets realized at some point or it doesn't, and
So
it's not happy with, yeah.
So I've done some crazy stuff, and in hindsight, every single action that I said, okay, like that my, you know, there's things that your mind wants to go to, and then the only way to sort of escape that, I found, is to take on a almost like, it's either you do the thing or you convince yourself that you don't need to do the thing, and then you become like an armchair intellectual. And I think that is like worse than just being in the dirt doing stuff, you know, because, well, if you actually have an inclination to do something. Yeah. I say I've like I've never done it. My boundary is it legal? Because if it's not legal, I'm going to jail. If it's legal, I'm gonna do it, and I'm going to if I can find a way to do it without breaking the law. I think the at the very least, the archetypal great father, which is different from the Godhead, at least the great father in principle approves of it, because that's the law. That's the law of the land. And I think you can. The thing about there's some exceptions, and those are the things that you know are moral, that would in principle break the law, but then you have the side of like, then you have God on your side. So it's like, so I try and do those things, because when I don't, I feel like I'm taking away from like at this point, it feels like I'm taking away from my understanding, at least. I think that yeah, and I thought that idea of seeing God's face and not being able to live, like, you know how people say there's living and then there's just being alive?
Okay.
Like, I don't know that if you saw God's face that you would probably not be able to live, you know, just have like a normal existence that you kind of liked, you know?
When you're asking, when you're making your points, it brings me back to the kind of the George MacDonald quotation that I kind of tried to quote or paraphrase earlier, where he asked, what happens if I forget this all-important piece of advice? And the answer is, then some evil that is good for you will follow. And if I remember, then some evil that is not good for you will not follow. When I was hearing your thoughts, Shane, it made me almost think like it's as if Shane is saying that of the two, it's better to have the evil that is good for you than it is to not have the evil that is not good for you. And
Yes.
because in effect, that's the route that, I mean, if we're saying that God predestined everything, and obviously that's like theologically very loaded, but like that's the route that God took, or at least the one that he allowed. And then there's always the question of what's the ultimate difference. And you know, like the Catholics at Easter, they say like, "Oh happy fault" or "Oh happy fall." I can never remember which, but it's kind of same difference. Because the understanding is that what followed as a result of that sin was something better than could have resulted from not sinning, even though. Well, I mean that's the thing. Like that's kind of why I like the George MacDonald quote, and kind of why I was talking about what I feel is an asymmetry between past and determined events and things that are still in process or still open. But nonetheless, that was kind of what my reaction was to what you were saying. That was kind of what I got from that. And Hezi is here.
Yeah.
Good
I would
evening.
say eat the fruit every time, because that's kind of our lot. We're not the second Adam. Eat the fruit, dude.
Well, see, the problem is this. It's like it reminds me of like a too ham-fisted approach to this really serious and complicated question is it reminds me of the Vampire in Brooklyn with Eddie Murphy, where Eddie Murphy the vampire at some point impersonates a preacher, and he goes in to preach, and he preaches how evil is good, because if there wasn't any evil, then there couldn't be any good. And that is well, in some way that is like, that would be a sort of, is finitization a word? It would be making the infinite finite, because it would be saying that it can't be what it is without a complement. And it would be saying, and that's the same problem as saying like Adam had to sin because if he didn't sin, then the best possible thing couldn't have resulted. It's some kind of problem that I would say comes from transgressing what I consider to be that important asymmetry, where like in the moment freedom, but after the fact determinacy. Because if you say that, well, I sinned and something good came from it, therefore that was somehow it's like that was the only way the good could have come. It's like it's like the MacDonald quotation. It gets the either-handedness of it to me suggestively correct, which is like, if I remember, then if I forget, then some evil that is good for me will follow. But if I remember, some evil not good for me will not follow. And then one sort of wants to say that both are equally good, or like it's like whenever you are not sinning, so that the evil that is not good for you is not following. You are doing God's positive will, and you're seeing His face. Like there has to be that side of things, otherwise, like there wouldn't there almost couldn't be any meaning to anything. You know what I mean? But I don't know. See, like the whenever it gets like the Eddie Murphy level of like saying like evil is good because without good there couldn't be evil, then there also feels like there's a problem. But I don't know if everyone necessarily disagree. Like I think New Agers, they often really talk that way. Like evil is just straight up good. That's it. Like, and to me that steps on something. But oh goodness, he's breaking down. Well, I'll let him in, but I'll let someone else talk too. Hold on.
Get away, Hezi.
Hey guys.
Hey.
I'll just jump in for a second. I don't want to wake up my boys. But I've been all over the comments. But generally speaking, I'm going to try to put a few things together over here. As far as us seeing God's face. So you are correct. Jacob was mentioning famously that God says, "You can't see my face," to Moses. However, we're told later on that God, Moses does see God face to face, and it says when he was talking, as if he was talking to another person. And this relates also to what we were talking about Jacob and Esau when it says Ra'iti Pnei El, where the sense is that you could see God because we're made in the image of God, and you could see God in, and this relates to love your neighbor as yourself, right? If you could recognize that God is in you and you could see that in yourself, then obviously you would love your neighbor that way as well. And when Moses was at a level when he would be talking to any person, he would be able to then see God shining through them, and that's when the conversation was happening. Now, with regards to what's happening at the cleft of the rock, when he wants to see God's face, and God says, "No, you can only see the back of my phylacteries." So, like Jacob was beautifully explaining, this really has to do with an integration of the intellectual as well, and then looking at your day-to-day life and seeing retroactively, sort of through history, how in these seemingly natural events, sometimes even evil events, am I still seeing God through these things? And this also all relates to, was it necessary for what happened with Adam or not, the sin? So when Adam sins, we say their eyes opened up, they could see for the first time. I mentioned this. We have a reversal of that with when Jacob blesses his sons. We have the whole issue with Esau and Jacob. There, we're talking about that with Isaac. Sorry, with Isaac, his eyes were heavy. He could not see, and this, I think, also relates to the sacrifice. He sort of went to a heaven state where you can no longer differentiate between good and evil, and that's why he couldn't see the difference between his two sons. But with Adam and Eve, once they eat, they could start differentiating. They notice that they're naked, that they're exposed, and there's ever since then we are looking again to discern between good fruit and evil fruit. I don't know if it was. I think it was necessary at some point for us to eat from that tree. However, we did so too early. So I think eventually we would have had the choice to decide, but we did so too early, and we were left now sort of in the dark, so to speak, needing to choose, but not being fully oriented and knowing how to discern between good and evil. Those were just a few thoughts, and I'll leave you with that, guys.
I could maybe riff on that just a little bit. This is like, so the choosing the knowledge of good and evil. When I grew up in church a lot, it would just be kind of like choosing knowledge. I think that was pretty, like this is the tree of knowledge, and people would leave off the good and evil part. But I think it's choosing basically kind of in a way declaring yourself as God. I'm all knowing in this area. I know good and evil. I can make a judgment call. Which, it used to rub me the wrong way when people would say, God is eventually going to give us that knowledge, and I would always be like, no, you don't do that. You don't play judge type thing. You don't say you know good and evil. But then even in the New Testament, towards the end, it says, doesn't know that you shall judge the world to come. Don't you know that you shall judge angels? So I do think it's completely accurate to say that fruit will be given to us. It was just taken at the wrong time. Because God would want to entrust you with the knowledge of good and evil, knowing good and evil. But it's where we, I think, misstep is where we, take that too soon, and in a way, almost declare ourselves as God in that act of doing so, or the judge, I guess you could say, divine judge, or something like that. Maybe not God, but judge.
So Cal, I have to correct you. Your son does look like you.
Yeah. Yes. But can he resemble me more than I do? That is the sort of that was the question, right?
Okay.
And the answer is both no and somehow yes. So I mean, but that anyway, yeah.
Well, that's why you say, "Do as I say, not as I do," right?
Yeah, he's very different from me, but also in some ways very much the same.
You know, Christian Golden said the same when I was talking to him one. He said there's a way that your children are more you than you could ever be. And I think it is in that negation of yourself that is embodied in them, because they're also your wife. You know.
So this is one of my favorite Mishnahs. It's Mishnah Sanhedrin 4:5. So it's talking about how when people come to give testimony before the Sanhedrin, they warn them about the importance of what they're doing, and it says. For thus we find, with respect to Cain, who killed his brother, as it says, the bloods of your brother call out. It does not say the blood of your brother, but rather the bloods of your brother, his blood and the blood of his potential offspring. Another explanation of the plural form, the bloods of your brother, for his blood was splattered, cast upon the trees and rocks. It was for this reason that man was created unique, to teach you that anyone who destroys one life from the Jewish people is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world. And anyone who saves one life from the Jewish people is as if he saved an entire world. And also to promote peace among people, that no one will say to his fellow, my ancestors are greater than yours. And also so that sectarians will not say, there are many powers in heaven. And also to express the grandeur of the Holy One, blessed be he. For a man strikes many coins from the same die, and all the coins are alike. Whereas the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, struck every man from the die of the first man, Adam, and yet no man is quite like his fellow. Therefore, every person is obligated to say, for me the world was created. And lest you say, why must we go? And then, that goes into a whole thing of why they should give testimony or not. But that always, whenever people talk about their children not being looking exactly like them, it reminds me of that thing of like God made all these coins and every single one looks different, even though they come from the same place.
Yes, and one wants to, one wonders something like This is really, this is really weird. It's kind of like it's related to like, did God have to create? We in the Abrahamic religions, we always want to say no, he didn't have to. He was free not to. But at least that's the way most Christian philosophers want to go. Ibn Taymiyyah, a Muslim theologian, said he did have to.
Yeah, and, we generally would say that God had no choice but to create, in that it was intrinsic to him to create.
Well, that's fascinating. And then there's even a question of like, in what sense have to? Because one always gets the sense that there has to be some sense in which he had to. There has to be some explanation of why the creation happened. And there's more that I can say on that. But the thing is, if God freely creates. See, it's like you're a creature. You exist contingently. You don't exist necessarily. You have a beginning. You come into being. There's a sense in which if you didn't exist, the world would go right on without you. Your existence isn't necessary, for the existence of the universe. There's all that, and yet God did create you, and so there's an explanation for why he created you, like the necessary being found it necessary to create you, and what is that? And so there's sort of a suggestion that God created you because he had something. You see, not only are you in the image of God, but you are uniquely in the image of God, and so that God created you because there was something. It's as if there was something he had to say about himself that he couldn't say without creating you. That's where it seems to go. That was kind of like my reaction.
I would disagree with that a little, Cal, just by, I mentioned this in the Bridges of Meaning, or no, maybe it was on Jacob's Discord, but that, God mentions this to us, Kedoshim tiyu ki kedoshani, you should be holy because I am holy. We don't even know what that really word means, holy. But God is, in a certain way, letting us know, and we know this from the days of creation. He makes the seventh day, he makes it holy, and then he stops. And there's a sense, and then he also tells the Israelites, be holy because I'm holy. There's a sense that God himself, right, is whatever this means, holy, and he's interested in not being the only one. And there's a sense of wanting to share and participate together in holiness with someone else. And I feel like that's where that conversation starts, of like the reason of why is because there's a sense of, again, it could be that it was, he needed to, but the reason of creation is to him to experience holiness, not by his lonesome.
You mean God?
I mean God.
So the only problem I have with that, not really a problem, but I think
You
like
could have many problems.
sovereignty. Yeah. So the first one is like that God being sovereign. I don't think that God needs us. I think that we as people need each other, and I think that is what he wants to see go well. But I think a sovereign God, and I think maybe this was like Nietzsche's arrogance, is he thought he could be all by himself, and he got people attribute his later stuff to like his syphilis, neurosyphilitic disorder, but other people think it was more spiritual. And I don't know, but I think like yeah, I just think like a sovereign God, like I think an individualized person still needs other people, but to become like, but I don't think God like needs people. I don't think I think he made them because he wanted to, and he thinks people can be good, but yeah,
I always have an instinct and inclination, just because I'm so liberal, at least theologically, that like I think of and agree with Manis Friedman, the rabbi, where he says, who needed whom, because you were just minding your business, not existing, and God of his own initiative created you. Or who said that every Jew is a letter in the Torah? I love that. Who
Well, that's I think
That's
it's
kind of,
but
there's no real attribution for that one.
No, I think that's in the Talmud.
That's in the Talmud, and it relates. Earlier, you were mentioning the mark of Cain. Well, in Hebrew, it's ot. It's really the letter of Cain, and the response of that is because Cain goes to God and says, basically, you're cutting me off, and then God's response is like, I'll mark you. But again, in Hebrew, it's a letter, and we are taught that God, as if tells Cain, that while I'm dispersing you, while I'm pushing you out, you are still one of the 24 letters of what I wrote the Torah with. As in, the letters could come back home eventually and recreate words. So the mark is really letting him know, not like this mark of like evil, rather to know that even him is still part of my letters. This is still part of my matrix that I love.
In a similar way, my heart always wants to say every human being is a necessary term in the self-revelation of God. That's the way my instincts run.
So I just have to clear something up because of the incredible internet kerfuffle over some stupid people calling Manis Friedman a heretic over this statement. Manis Friedman likes to say important and deep things in fresh and sometimes easily misunderstood, but
and there in so doing, he thereby stirs up the actual heretics like yours truly. He gets them all excited over potentially nothing.
So what you were saying, like I don't think you were expressing what he was saying in a heretical manner. But there's been quite a kerfuffle on the internet over this statement of his because of people understanding it differently than how you're understanding it.
Yes.
Which is, yes, I mean, the aseity of God is an important concept. God wants, doesn't need us. But at the same time, there's a question of when you talk about a non-contingent being, when you talk about the necessary being, is that which God wants, right? So the question becomes, God is good, right? God is an attribute. Good is an attribute of God. It does not capture God. Similarly, loving, right, is an attribute of God. It does not capture God. And like that's understanding that it is an expression of godliness and an expression of God's will. But can God will anything other than to be good and to be loving? And in a sense, you have to say, because of divine simplicity, which it took me a while to warm up to divine simplicity, but I have. In a very real sense,
paradoxical. It's extremely sort of paradoxical by its nature.
It is, but ultimately, I think you have to concede to God's simplicity in His divine nature. At the same time, understanding that expressions of God are imperfect in that they are expressions. Hasidus would talk about how a light after it has emanated from the sun is no longer completely unified to the source of its light. And so any emanation of God's will, for example, his goodness and his lovingness and his justice and his mercy and everything else, right? Those things fail to capture him completely. And in a similar manner, they fail to be completely like, but God is, and he can do no other.
That's why we say God, our Lord, is truth, emet, in our prayer, because he is the only thing that is truth. I am that I am. That is the only thing that is, in fact, true. Everything else, like Jacob is saying, are echoes. These are remnants of, shadows of the things we see in our reality, but that is the constant.
And I have to correct your language. It's I am becoming that which I am becoming.
Right, it's true. It's I becoming and that I'm becoming, and I am that I am. I stand corrected. Thank you, Jacob.
One might say, it's like, maybe you would say, like, God is not free to not be free to do what he wants to do, and what he wants to do is like what is
exactly
what is loving. And so yeah, he has no. Yeah, I mean, Christianity, we do say God is love, and there's some interesting, important differences there. Maybe, that maybe they track linguistically, like the Hebrew doesn't have the copula, right? And in Greek, it says hatheos agape estin. It's using the copula. And so Jesus is God. God is love. So Jesus is love. Theoretically, Jesus is free not to go to the cross. It's a free decision, because like every decision of love is like, it has to be a free decision. It has to be uncoerced. And yet at the same time, there's no realistic question of his ever not going, because his love is perfect.
But he says, "Your will, not mine, be done." So
that's true. Yeah.
This goes back to what I said at the very beginning, that the crucifixion is a textbook example of permissive as opposed to positive will, which is why it completely refutes so much of Christianity, like the underlying bases of Christian ideas. Right? It's Jesus is submitting himself to the will of God, which means that they have two different wills, which, like, I mean, the idea of the will of the Father and the will of the Son not being the same. Like,
Yeah.
that's been one of the major things that Christians have been killing each other over for thousands of years.
That, I mean,
Huh.
that's look. There's that's extreme. Like, there's no getting around at least 90% of what you said. What I started with was I now I'm gonna question like the use of the ad. Well, I see textbook. I almost feel like I was using it as an adverb. Like, if you were just taking like the kind of uh, the simple or the superficial approach, and you're just saying, well, does it involve something bad happening? You know, and then if so, then you just put it in the permissive will category. Yet there's something one wants to say that, you know, there's going to be the way that, you know, the cloud has a silver lining, and the silver lining was the actual ultimate point of the cloud all along, because at the end the distinction between his permissive and positive wills has a way of vanishing. Why? Because God is omniscient and omnipotent, which means that for him there's no question of his ever having an excuse along the lines of I didn't know or I wasn't able to. So
but then you're completely negating, and that's why I said textbook example of permissive will, because then you're completely negating the idea of permissive will. You can't have permissive will if all of God's permissive, everything that is God's permissive will is necessarily part of his.
It's the same as to say it's like from the side of the infinite. The infinite is the infinite, and the infinite is also the finite. It's the side of, it's like the non-dual side, and that would also be like this kind of this hypothetical point from which God sees. It would be the sort of God's eye point of view, or like the final analysis, where that distinction would seem to fall away. But you were saying something else too that I won't let myself get off the hook of, which is Jesus said, I and the Father are one. We have one will. And
No.
then he's,
well, yeah, he does. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the implication is that there is one will, and then in the agony in the garden in Gethsemane, he's submitting his will to the Father. So suggesting a difference in will, because it's not what I will, but your will be done. So there's, I mean, of course, the Orthodox Christology, which took centuries to unfold and develop, you know, right after they figured out that, you know, and decided that, you know, Jesus is actually like God, and you know, codify it, and the Christology is that he has two natures. He has a divine nature and a human nature, and yet he's one person. And as a person, he is said to be a divine person. And so, sort of the apologist kind of like textbook Catholic answers route here, I guess, is to say that you know, when he had some will other than the Father's, that was his human will, you know, as distinct from, let's say, his divine will, which is one with the Father's. Of course, that's in an important way. It's only pushing the question back, and you know, it's fair to say that I think about this question a great deal. I think about, like, for example, Jesus Christ is God by nature, and he's also man by nature, because he has human nature and divine nature. You know, assuming you believe that is metaphysically possible, which I don't believe that you do. The question is whether he was always originally, well, I mean that, you know, like if you go back enough, it looks like the Reformers and maybe Aquinas, like they're understanding, like they're understanding the divine person as originally sort of a logos, a sarkos, like an unfleshed logos. And then there's another understanding in Christian theology which somehow views the Word made flesh as intrinsically having to have always been, or having to always be regarded as incarnate. And maybe what it gets at is the question of whether, and because that's a genuine question in Christian theology, or at least it was, I think maybe still is, the question of whether the incarnation was always intended to happen from, sort of from before the foundation of the world, or whether it was like a sort of a plan B response to sin. So in Christian theology, you've got the difference between so-called supralapsarian and infralapsarian, like respectively corresponding to sort of plan A and plan B theologies. And I think that somewhat tracks with the question of what we were talking about earlier, like whether God is free to create. And on some level, it's free, it's open, but another level, it's not a question, because he's going to do what sort of maximal love dictates or requires. And so in that way, if one regards the incarnation as a fait accompli, then one can find a theological route to saying that Jesus Christ is always and originally both God and man, which I know obviously is not anything kosher to Jews or to Noahide Gentiles or
well, yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it, I think you create so many contradictions in this idea, right? And like, I think this idea of Jesus, the way Christians generally view it, it just creates so many problems. With monophysite and diaphysite, and
right,
and
it sure does.
And then with the one will and two wills, and one mind and two minds, and ultimately, I think these contradictions have to fall away, and I think Christians eventually are going to have to decide that it's simpler than they're trying to make it. And I'm not sure they will want to do that. I mean, there's a certain attractiveness. So, for example, Christians constantly say, Jesus trampled death with death, right? And it's like, it's a cute thing to say, and it's like, oh, trample death with death. But it's like, but people are dying every day. So what are you talking about, trample death with death? Right? And similarly, like, Jesus was the perfect man, the incarnation, and he fulfilled the law, and he conquered, like, and it's like, they're tempting things to believe in, but when you try to make them real, honestly, it reminds me of so in the book club we're reading The Great Partnership, and Rabbi Sachs talks about this philosopher who would take his class to a restaurant, and he would order soup, and the waiter would say, what type of soup would you want? We have this soup and that soup. And he would be like, no, I just want soup. I want soup. I don't want like a soup. I don't want chicken soup. I don't want, borscht. I want the ideal of soup. Yes. Right? And you can't eat soup, right? And it's in the incarnation, in the physical manifestation, that it becomes obvious that Jesus just isn't. He may be made in the image of God, and in fact, I believe everybody is made in the image of God, and that's fine. But when you collapse that into saying this bowl of chicken soup is soup, you're creating a contradiction that I think just is so obvious. I think Christians eventually are going to have to give it up. I'm not saying they're going to.
So, but would you give the disciples? Would you respect the disciples that they said, "This is the best damn soup I've ever had, and it's probably the best damn soup that you'll ever have, and we're gonna have some bread and some wine, and we're gonna try and eat this, Soup.
So there's a reason I have a picture of the Eunucha up on my wall, right? He's the most impressive human being. He teaches Torah in ways that before I was able to listen to him, right? I did not. I only knew that there was somebody, the Rebbe, who died in 1994, and nobody else was such a manifestation of a rabbi, of a leader, and somebody who teaches Torah like the Eunucha, right? And it still blows my mind that he's only 35 years old. And so, in a sense, I am saying he is Christ, right? I am saying that ideal of an anointed man of God, or like if I have a great bowl of matzo ball soup, I can say, oh, this is soup, and it is an ideal form of soup. At the same time, I have to admit that it is just one hypostasis of that ideal. And I have to admit that the Eunucha or the Rebbe or any other great rabbi is one hypostasis of this ideal that we're made in the image of. But ultimately, I think Christians have to come down to it. And I think, so I say that the doctrine of the Assumption negates the doctrine of the Incarnation, right? Because the way the Christians understand it, God became incarnate in Jesus, and he was resurrected in a spiritual body where he was here, right? But then why was he assumed? Why is he still not here? Why can't I have fish and put my hands in his wounds, right? Because those two things are contradictory, and I mean, when I heard the first time that it really, in John, where Jesus says, don't hold on to me, woman, for I have not yet ascended to my God and your God, my Father and your Father, right? In a very real sense, that's like Jesus saying, I'm sorry, we don't have soup. We have matzo ball soup and chicken soup and like, but there's no soup here. You can't just order soup.
Yeah, so this is great, and it's something I've thought a lot about too, in the context of like, can one just ever just drive a Honda? Same concept, different context, but and so this is the question of whether the infinite can just straight up be the finite, right? And from the standpoint of the two-valued logic, no, because if you have the concept of the infinite, it needs some complement or negation to be set off from. And yet, on another level, that is to speak of the infinite as being limited. It's limited to not be the finite. And so, like, some more infinite conception of the infinite does allow it to be the finite. But then you have this question. Well, see, this is because you and I, this isn't our first rodeo.
Yeah.
Because the other direction that this goes theologically, is sort of on what principled basis, if any, can we distinguish between the divinity of Jesus Christ and the divinity of anybody else? Because let me see what I'm saying here. So the doctrine, the dogma is that Jesus Christ is God by nature, because he's the second person of the Trinity. He has a divine nature, therefore he's God by nature. I think it's a legitimate understanding of Christian theology to say that we ourselves are able to become God, but by grace, not by nature. Become God, I think, even in the same way that Jesus Christ is God. which one might even say is to be a reflection of nothing more than God's positive or active will. Now, the thing is, so what was I? There's something I was going to try to say here. To become God by grace, not by nature.
But are you like God, like Jesus, if he is God by nature and you are not?
He is God by nature and you are not. That, I mean, that's a wonderful question. And again, it's getting at like this kind of like asymmetry between two valued and one valued logic. I mean, the writings of Maximus the Confessor are really so radical that my understanding is that he talks about one becoming the Lord himself and becoming uncreated, which is more radical than most Christians can stomach.
That's not more radical than I can stomach, because I agree with that. But that stops removing Jesus. And before I forget, so when we talk about the infinite, we're saying apophatically it is that which is not finite, right? Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately it does have to be apophatic how we describe an infinite God. So, like, I have no problems with saying what God is not, and saying that that's a better description than saying what God is. Whereas you seem to be saying that saying what God is not is bounding God. And I think it's less bounding of God than to say what God is.
Okay, so I guess how my mind wants to try to approach these distinctions is like, because you have Bertrand Russell and your paradoxes of set theory, and like does the barber shave himself who shaves all the barbers who like don't shave themselves or something like that? It's like crazy stuff. So like he found it necessary to make like sort of first order and a distinction between first order and second order predication. And so it would be something like this, like we would say that God has a second, the only kind of limitation that God has is the second order limitation, that so on some first order of predication, he have no limits. But if we could not even limit him at a second order level, there would be a problem of him being so apophatic that we can't even meaningfully refer to him. So that there's a way that we have to place some limitation on God, but we acknowledge it's not on the same level as the other kind. He's not the limit of not being able to have a limit is not the same kind of limit as like not being able to be super strong or not being able to be omnipotent or something like that. And yet there's a way that I wonder whether even this move using the first and second order predication distinction doesn't turn the dialectical wheel like if it doesn't actually just set it off rolling, so that we're no longer even doing first and second order, but rather now third, fourth, fifth, and going on into nth order. Now the thing is, if you had caught me earlier in the day, I could say more what I think I mean by this. I kind of shoot from the hip, and if we're saying God is infinite simpliciter, then we aren't allowing there to be something like a second order limit placed on him. And so we're saying, no, he's that which does not even have those kinds of limits. And then that's third order implicitly. But then once we discover that, then we're like, no, but he doesn't even have that limit, and so on. And, there's a certain way that I'm pointing at a kind of runaway dialectic here. And it's going to be just as operative in Christian theology as in, if effectively, Christianity was a sect of Judaism that became something else. Like because what I was remembering in the article, it's like, let no sectarian say there's more than one power in heaven. It's like I'm always very struck by the story of Elisha ben Abuya and the 4 who entered the Pardes, and one died, one lost his sanity, one became a heretic. Only one survives with his orthodoxy intact, but then he's later, he's martyred and he's skinned alive. So Elisha ben Abuya, I feel a kind of kinship with him because my mind runs in similar heretical directions, but in Christianity, or in analogously heretical directions. But again, my mind only runs in those directions. I don't necessarily say that I commit myself to those heresies, but so in other words, there was a sort of dialectical potential for danger in the workshop of Jewish theological ideas. And then once you set that ball rolling, then you have things like what Maximus says, like one can become uncreated, one can even, if it were possible, become the Lord himself. And that's see where that goes to is that kind of makes you think of the New Age conception of like, well, we're all God, but then like God like made himself forget that he was God, and then that's how we could end up down here. Well, then the question is like, if he can ever be nescient or forgetful, then then he just wouldn't be God, right? And so like there's like a basic confusion of terms there. And I mean, like this is what's tricky for me is like how I would say I wouldn't say I am God, because that's like saying the finite is the infinite. But there does seem to be an allowable sense in which the infinite is both the infinite and also the finite, so that every person is like a kind of God in an alter mode, God in the mode of not God.
You are in the image of God.
Yeah,
Right.
and well, obviously, whatever is going on here as far as the full like theological like intricacies, it's something to do with all this relationship
okay.
between.
I think one good baseline for saying, would you? So in my trying to become, so I was baptized as a Baptist. I asked Richard Rollin his opinion. He said just wait and get baptized Orthodox. But it was a special thing with me and my mom, and so I got baptized. And so since then, I think it has been I've tried to do the right thing, and at one point I just told a friend of mine, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna try. I am Bruce Almighty trying to find out what I can't do. And like, I think if your baseline, could you be perfectly happy in a situation where everybody would say, F that? And I think like, if you put yourself there, I think it's a good meditation on so I think being that person rather than being the reason that other people would say F that is like a starting goal that I would go with, like, as like, rather than like, don't be evil, don't be good, put it in a context and then be like, what would I want to be in a story that I would want to read? And then you can play characters and all of those characters are needed, and then you don't have a problem with like, I'm good, I'm bad. Well, like in a moral sense, it's more like play acting a character in your own,
I'm not sure I'm understanding you, Shane, but at the same time, I'm also kind of mentally worn out by this. And I'm thinking Cal is as well. And I'm thinking maybe it might be best to wind down the
Sure.
stream. So, Cal, what do you have to say?
Now is a good stopping place for me too. I think, Shane, though, I was following what you were saying to some degree, because you're trying to draw like what's the moral import of all this, and like kind of at the end of the day, like what sort of person am I aspiring to be? And there's going to be a certain way in which, like, one feels like obviously it does wear one out to think about these theological puzzles, and one almost wonders whether the mind itself does not afford enough representational capacity, like not enough dimensions, as it were, but life as you live it out, it gives you enough dimensions to sort of to sort of live out the self-resolving paradox kind of thing. So your mind is going like to the moral direction. It's like okay, but who am I trying to be? And you know, like I think I understand that inclination. We have a renegade who's joining back with us.
Let me know if this sounds messed. I've never tried this on my phone before, so I have no idea, and I don't have headphones.
Jason, while you were gone, I regret to inform you that I have verifiable evidence that several individuals have out Pizza the Hut successfully.
Yeah, I know.
And that was entirely because you were gone. You were falling asleep at the wheel, so to speak. God forbid.
Discussion in the store once about how many different pizza places over Pizza Hut, but whatever. Where'd Jacob go?
Jacob said he was worn out, which I understand that.
Yeah. And like it. I'm wearing the shirt.
But the thing is, I'm always worn out, so I'm good to continue through some torturous, you know, deformation of Hegelian logic. Well, we got Shane here, but we don't know Shane's story.
Yeah. Well, can I say one thing before you do that?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Because I was leaving comments and I probably missed.
I wasn't freaking reading any comments with that.
Well, no, they were in the
they're in comments, not private chat. Oh, Sherry is here.
Yeah.
I didn't even know the whole time. Is Sherry still here? She's here. It's called Where Your Theological Rubber Hits the Road, eh?
But I was saying
Canadian wisdom. It flows pure as the melted ice of the Canadian Rockies, if that's an actual Canadian mountain range. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say I was trying to leave in the comments that I think the fact that Jacob keeps bringing this up, I think is really profound, and we've touched on it before. But I mentioned Thomas is what I was leaving in the chat, but it was the wrong one. In our conversation about the eyes of Thomas and things like that, where it's hard to make that I don't think. This is probably just me projecting my own opinion too much, but it seems like in a lot of Christian thought, I don't know that we're able to make that leap or step into theosis, because
because I told you I predestined it. We were going to have to exegete John 10:35 today. That was fated, and it's coming to pass. If he called them gods to whom the God came, why do you say that I blaspheme when I say that I'm the Son of God? This is the most dangerous, like, just irresponsible, dynamite-laden theological verse.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. And I think that we're still saying, like, what I left in the comment was, like, we're a lot of Christians, we still say, you know, when did we see you, Lord? Like in Matthew 25, we're still looking around. We see you, Jesus. When do we? Instead of actually like Thomas looking at, like, eventually we're gonna have to look at every man and basically say something like my Lord and my God, like what Thomas did. And that's the twin, right? That's the twin, and that's the twin commandments, like Jacob keeps bringing up. The twin commandments is love the Lord and love your God. And Thomas is called Thomas the twin. They call him that over and over again. So there's something, and even like when we were talking about this story of Castor and Pollux in the Greek mythology, like one of them's divine, one of them's not. And so there's all this stuff is like,
one of Jesus' natures is divine, the other is not. What's going on with that?
Yeah, exactly.
How is it that the infinite is as it were composed of two elements, the infinite and the finite, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, so I didn't mean to do that. But Shane, yeah, I would like to hear more about you as well.
Oh yeah. So after my last so for like the past like almost year, not quite a year, probably the past like 8-9 months, I had sort of a breakup, and I just decided to go on like a religious journey.
Did you say wake up or breakup?
Breakup. I believe she had the wake up, if the wake up call, if I do say so. But I went went to Georgia, and then I worked with
Georgia
my
the
uncle.
country or Georgia the state?
Georgia the state.
Okay.
Georgia the state. Yeah. And then
I thought that was probably what it was, but
yeah. And then I got baptized, and then I ended up in Las Vegas, and then I came back here to the Central Valley in California, where I was kind of like raised, and I'm just trying. I think that the constantly rejuvenated, like if you find a mode of being where you are constantly rejuvenated, even for a moment, I think like you found something good. At least you might say like part of, you've entered the kingdom, and I think the longer you can stay there, maybe you could call it like the Tao might be a more reasonable way of putting it, like of thinking. I think it's more the Tao than it is. I think you the more you try and stay there, the more you try and stay in the Tao, you realize that the more you try and stay in the ideal state that every religion tells you to stay in, the more you realize it's Orthodox Christianity has it all. Like, and that's, I think I baptized Baptist, but I really have sentiments.
One of my favorite Tao quotations is "Know the white keeps it the black. You can't know it, but you can be it," which is very Tao Te Ching. But I mean that's all very much resonating with me, what you're saying. And I'm really I only just now discovered the comment section. I realized all these people I know are in here. There's like Batsani is here. I think he's from Bridges of Meaning. There is Christian Golden was in here. It's kind of crazy because I didn't even know like I could go onto the comment section. So it's kind of a feeling. But anyway, yeah, I'm sorry. You can go ahead, because you're saying like the more you stay in it, the more you feel like Orthodox Christianity just has everything. Now, do you mean big O or small O?
I mean I'll just say Pageauian, the stuff I learned from Jonathan Pageau, and the stuff the more,
like Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty amazing. I'm not gonna lie. Gary is Orthodox.
Yeah, I asked if you want to know a conversation I had with my sister the other day. So we were talking. My brother was getting so he's like more. I've been talking to him a lot about it, but he's definitely a hardline freaking Billy Graham scripture. If something comes out of your mouth, it better be scripture if you're talking about what's true, kind of thing.
Yes.
And
sure.
yeah, and I was like kind of speculating, would if Jesus wouldn't have came and the church that came after him wouldn't have built these beautiful structures, like what else is beautiful? Like, would there be anything beautiful if we didn't have Jesus as the example? Like, and then these churches, and then modern day, it's like down to like the individual, seeing how beautiful the individual is. Would we have any sense of that whatsoever had Jesus not died on the cross, got nailed to it, and then died and resurrected in shame and humiliation? Like, and then rest, and then glory flips death into glory. Like, would there be any sense of beauty?
And I'm sorry, I missed this. Did you say you said this to your sister?
Yeah, I said this to my brother and sister. Yeah, they were there.
And they're like, but they're like Billy Graham style evangelicals, is what you're saying.
My sister is a hardline atheist.
Oh, you told me. Okay, you say she's an atheist, but the brother is an evangelical.
Yes. My younger brother, 3 years younger than me, 24 right now.
Right. Okay. Right. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, you told them all that. And that, sorry, and I'm just, were you gonna say more, or you were just saying that was the point you were impressing on them?
Yeah, that's the point that I think. Like, I would just not so much be like. I just want to share that and see what somebody outside of, I think we're pretty stable, but it's like, what do people like? What would you think about that thought?
That's interesting, because if you're talking about sort of my journey as a Christian, I am American, so in some sense, but I was not raised Christian at all. So if one comes to the faith, from a background of not having been part of it, there's a certain way that one is, I would say, Protestant by default. And so, I was, even though like the first expressions of Christianity that spoke to me were Catholic, and still are. Let me see. Sorry, Hezi is okay. And Hezi is very kind. And so, one of the things that I kind of felt a longing for, kind of in my evangelical wilderness period, which maybe like now as a kind of self-imposed exile, I'm still there in certain ways. Well, I was longing for like some way that I could touch like Jesus. Like I wanted the physical contact with the man himself, because we're always studying words, and we're studying the scriptures. You search the scriptures thinking that they have eternal life, but the scriptures speak of me. Damn it, sorry, but
yeah.
And so that I thought, if I'm not aware of anything that Jesus actually touched. Maybe just I'm not a good Catholic yet, so I don't know all the relics. But the Shroud of Turin, they say, touched him. I always kind of assumed, even as a Christian, I kind of always assumed that was fake. And anyway, that is a long rabbit hole about that. But
yeah.
But he founded the church, and I can sort of touch the church door, so to speak. And there's more to it than that, obviously, because of what Catholics and Orthodox believe about the sacraments. But see, originally at that level of like awareness of Protestant and Catholic and other theologies, like I didn't have any kind of longing for the sacraments. I scarcely knew what they were. But I mean, there's a certain level on which I can relate to what you're talking about, and that's definitely getting at the participatory dimensions of the Christian religion, and how those are more present in Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Most present in Orthodoxy, there's no question about that. The way that Orthodoxy is so kick ass is the fact that like the liturgy sounds good even in English. There's no reasonable expectation that one could have like that it should sound good in English, but it seriously does. If one is letting aesthetics be the priority in one's decision making process, then I can certainly understand why
Sure.
People would be orthodox, and Sorry, see, now that I've discovered the comment section, I'm distracted because I see Luke here.
Hey,
Luke
that's all right.
here.
That's all right. I know
and
how it is.
I have really bad like ADHD, which just basically means very, very poor executive functioning. Even when my working memory wasn't good, even when it wasn't bad, it used to actually be pretty good. The executive functioning itself trips things up.
But it's also people you know, and the fact that you've known them for a long time, it's like a safe bet that they have something good to say, and it's like,
yeah,
it's that's what friends are for.
Yeah, and also self-consciousness, just pure and simple.
Sure.
Yeah, executive function sucks, Mrs. Unity's right. We'll leave executive functioning to the smart dumb people, and we dumb smart people will continue to be smart in our curiously dumb ways.
Yes.
And Batsani apologizes, but I don't know for what. Maybe just for having great executive functioning, huh? I don't know Batsani as well. Yeah, no. Well, it sounds like you're trying to live orthodoxy. So are you are you joining the church or?
So, no, I was going to a Baptist church, and then I found a church. I've found Orthodox churches. The closest one to me that I would want to go to is one that I went to before, called Holy Cross Monastery in. It's near. So you know Paul, right?
Vanderclay.
Yeah. Well, it's near closer towards the bay than I am. It's like probably an hour and a half from me. Holy Cross Monastery is awesome. I want to go there, but the closest thing to me that I will go to is the Christian Reformed Church of the city I'm in. And I talked to them like months ago, and they actually do know Paul. And I was just talking to them about like my plans and like that October thing that's coming up, right? At the end of October, the art conference in London, the roundtable discussion. Okay, okay.
I've been out of the loop as far as the Bridges of
Hey,
Meaning,
that is
regrettably.
That is it's finding it out, like finding it out on your own will be so like thrilling. So I encourage you, if something thrills you, like don't take it from other people. Like that is your route to do your like excitement, especially if you have a kid and like a family. Like you have to have some like thing you're expecting to do that excites you. You know what I mean?
You kind of do have to, but at the same time, like I have hardcore anhedonia that doesn't show in conversation, and partly because I actually find conversation genuinely stimulating. I love theology. I'm addicted to theology, and in some way to very little else. In other words, you talk about like one of the things that I fear the most, like on like a primal existential level, is like going to like these things that people really want to go to and spend a lot of money on. People like Luke, where like you have like a beer festival or something where you stand in the hot sun and you pay lots of money for like overpriced beer, and it's like to me like that like it just like causes pain in my soul to just contemplate.
So you don't want to be in that position where you're in line buying beer.
I don't want to be anywhere that's not home, and like I don't want to be talking about anything that isn't theology, and that makes me permanently boring to people.
Same. Yeah.
And and it's kind of like in my early 20s, I did, if I'm kind of being irresponsibly honest or forthcoming, I think had a brush with schizophrenia almost, that maybe it was divine healing from God that prevented me from going all the way there. But I still have some of the traits of like positive and negative schizotypy, and like one of them, the negative traits, is the anhedonia and the social withdrawal. And that's just kind of how I am. I'm a weird cat.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just kind of rambling. Maybe I'll cut myself off here.
Yeah. So could I ask you a question?
By all means.
So I think so do you think that the anhedonia, or not the anhedonia, the social withdrawal part, do you think that you don't seem like you're avoidant, like, of things like that? Things, one thing I know, like, if I can tell, like, I don't know, if somebody is anxious and they're talking to me about theology, that's a sign to me that they're not actually into theology. They're just into not dealing with the problem. But you seem like you like theology because it helps you deal with God. Like,
that's
God.
actually 100% correct. In some sense, I'm just a person with a very high functioning person with like several, maybe more than several mental illnesses, and it's really all because of God, and also by temperament, there is a way that I am deeply avoidant, but my own understanding of God as the kind of the ultimate, it's like he's like the identity of identity and non-identity in Hegelian terms. Like the reality is a continuum of identities, and God is the identity of identity itself. He's like the whole continuum. He's the identity that is so broad as to support, all the variegations and differences that exist, in reality, and people, and clashes of conflicting wills, and conflict and strife and war. Like God's identity is so broad as to contain it all. And there's a way that the knowledge of that acts as a continual spur in me to see myself in the other person, in any other person, in every other person, and to always be open to empathy and connection. And I'm also, like I said, I'm kind of weird, and sometimes I even think that God talks to me, not in an audible voice though. And I think one of the things that God revealed to me was that between any two persons, there's an infinite capacity for love. And that it says in scripture that one died for all, therefore all died. And how I kind of interpret that is like, when you know who you are to Jesus, or when you think of what Jesus did or suffered for you, then you know who you are to him. And then when you know who you are to him, then in some sense, you know who you are, full stop. Because if he called you worthy, that you're unworthy. Because in Christianity, we spend a lot of time talking about how much we suck. But if he called you worthy,
right,
who are you to say that you're not? And so that's an interesting, sort of provocative point. And then there's also, but see, here's the other thing is, that he died for everyone else too. So when you reflect on the other person that you're with, you reflect on what Jesus did for them, then you know who they are to Jesus. Then you know who they are. If you were worthy of his death, who is to say you're not worthy of mine? So as a Christian, I'm called to live into that. And that's what, as far as I'm concerned, the meaning of the verse, one died for all, therefore all died, it's saying. And so that's something like the logic of the gospel as it unfolds. It's making you into an ultra Christus. And obviously I'm not that, but I am more like that than I used to be. And so that's definitely part of it. In my case, that's like Hezi says, it's all about God. So that's
so I think like I sort of decided that so I'm not really into like theology that's systematized, just because, well, I'm into the person. I think there's something in people that wants to do. People who do theology, there's something in them that wants to do it. I think once theology becomes systematized, I think you are bending a knee to culture and like people's wanting something, wanting a product from you, like something they can grasp for themselves. And I think like that's why I like Kierkegaard, is because when he died, it didn't seem like there was this box. It was just like all of reality that he could manifest with what he knew. Like, then that was what, and there were no borders besides the time he was born and the time he died. Like,
Okay.
he had this whole life that tried to live Christ-like.
Yeah.
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 Or
That's
tried to act as himself, you know?
yes. Yeah, that's true, because I think I haven't actually read anything by Kierkegaard. The sense I
that
get
right?
of him, yeah, I haven't read much of anything at all. That's kind of the dirty secret that don't actually really try to keep hidden. But
You seem like you like Hegel.
huh?
You seem
That's
like
all
you like Hegel.
that's all secondhand, like secondary sources. So I know
See, I wasn't going to say anything antagonistic because Kierkegaard really hated everything about Hegel's system.
Yeah.
Just
I don't know very much. I don't know very much about Hegel.
Okay.
And to the extent that I refer to myself as a Hegelian, it's sort of jokingly and self-deprecatingly. Like, look at what kind of character I am. Always talking about crazy stuff like the dialectic. Can't you just believe what the Bible says? Damn it! You know, it's like, but I was gonna say, well, my sense of Kierkegaard is that when he wrote, he cut himself and he bled. And there's other people whom I can think of who are in a similar way. They always laid themselves open to the wounding, you know, that inevitably comes from encounter with, any serious truth that's really worthy of the name, right? And so like Wittgenstein, I think of in that category, and he's not someone I know terribly much about either. But he was always wrestling with the questions that he was wrestling with, and so in that way he was dying to himself. And there's something Christ-like about that people instinctively resonate with. And so Kierkegaard, I don't know very much about him, except that I wouldn't even know. I don't even know if I know enough about him to say that he lived his own theology. Maybe he didn't, and maybe that was why he was so bitter. But there's a certain sense in which one cannot fail to live one's own rule. But then there's also another sense in which one cannot help but fail to live up to it as well, ultimately. So I don't know if you had more thoughts to say about that and Kierkegaard.
Yeah. So he do you know the story of him and Regina Olsen?
I do. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean he wouldn't. She was really young, wasn't she? Like by our societal standards, it's like kind of gross to think about marrying someone with that kind of age difference. But he could have married her, and he chose to not, and he was filled with regret. But it was kind of like he was kind of maybe conscious of the fact that he was gonna almost die of regret either way, because he was just like that neurotic of personality. Like if he married her.
Yeah, he thought that he broke off their engagement, and there's several like people who think different. So he said that he did not want to involve her in the depression of his family. That was one thing. He also said that he did not want to. There's another, like, he could live off this substance that his father's inheritance gave him, but it was only enough for one person. And so he had to decide between being a writer seriously and finishing his schoolwork. Well, first he decided to be a writer rather than be a married man. And that was his, he just made, he learned, like, choice was the crucial thing. And so he did that. And then years
he made
later,
a choice
like,
based on fear, like a scarcity mindset.
yeah,
years later.
yeah, you could say he was an old school scarcicist. And then
But
he, yeah, go ahead.
No, years
So
later,
he said,
then.
yeah, so years later, after she got married, he wrote to Regina Olsen's, Schlegel was the last name of the guy that she married to, and he wrote to him first, seeing if he would let her read the letters that he had for her, and he said no. So Kierkegaard dropped it. He was like, okay, so she's not going to read my letters. But then they would, like, purposefully, strategically cross paths in the town streets and just, like, give each other glances and stuff. Like, that was their yeah. And so he remained obsessed with her, like, his whole life. And then one day she, like, stopped him and was like, I understand what you were doing this whole time. Like, she was like, showed gratitude. And then he died and said that he was happy, like, on his deathbed. Not happy, but he was, like, glowing, kind of, is what, like, the transcription of what the girl, is it called wet nurse, the person by your deathbed?
Oh no, but I don't know what it is called.
Okay. So I think he was, like, morbidly, I think he was morbid, but I more see, like, the humor in what he wrote. Like, that's sort of what I notice, and maybe it's just because I have a morbid sense of humor, so anything that's morbid I think is funny. That is morbidly funny. I just call funny.
Well, it reminds me of his story, as you relate it, reminds me of what you were saying earlier, where on some level you would rather choose the evil that is good for you than avoid the evil that is supposedly not good for you, right?
Yes.
And so he was making a decision based on fear, and it seems like maybe he regretted it. And goodbye to Batsani. I just noticed he's leaving. And Hezi says some of our sages call this internal, this self-doubt, they call it internal Amalek, which I'm less knowledgeable about. I guess it's like the Amalek is like, it's the tribe, the Canaanite peoples that kind of assault the Israelites on the way to the promised land, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know about this stuff. Jung
had a criticism of Kierkegaard that he didn't use his anxiety to propel him forward, basically.
Who said that?
Carl Jung.
Oh, okay. And yeah, okay. Well, the other thing that it reminded me of was, see, very few people will probably even know whom I'm talking about, but there was a Japanese writer called Yukio Mishima.
Okay.
And he was a real crazy guy, because he ended his life by, like, forming a paramilitary youth organization that, like, kind of almost, if I'm not mistaken, stormed the imperial palace. And then they were trying to effect a coup, but in that strangely polite way that Japanese insurgents always do, like, assassinate someone and then apologize to their wife, like, like weird stuff, like. And so they were doing this coup with no real expectation of actually gaining political power. and it was really more so a pretext for Yukio Mishima to be able to commit ritual suicide in the way that the samurai did, which was
Right.
what they call seppuku, where it's belly slicing. So you have your second. You cut your own stomach open, and then your second cuts off your head. And then the beheading was somewhat botched in Mishima's case, which is morbid to think about. But at least on the second or third swing, I believe they got it right. And but he wrote a series of 4 books. It was called The Sea of Fertility, which his name was supposed to be a kind of dark pun, or a sort of it was supposed to be an expression of cosmic nihilism, because on the moon's surface there is a kind of barren or dry like like a crater system. It's like it looks like it could be an ocean, but obviously there's no water on the moon. And astronomers, for whatever reason, called it the Sea of Fertility, but obviously there's nothing fertile about it. Nor is it even really a sea. And so it was a cool quartet of books, because it was called The Sea of Fertility, and it traced, because in these Eastern Buddhist influenced cultures, they have a notion of reincarnation that it expresses itself like one is almost like a detective on the case of like a reincarnation trail, and you find out who's the reincarnation of whom based on certain physical signifiers like birthmarks that correspond to areas of trauma in like the way that the person is supposed to have died, something like that. So the Sea of Fertility, it is about, and in the first installment, what made me think of Kierkegaard's story was how the main character is he is like some kind of evil Hegelian, because his logic is so evil in that sort of characteristically dialectical way, where there's a romantic relationship that he could have, that if he says yes to this woman, or if he proposes to this woman at the right season, then he can have theoretically everything he wants, but he can never be satisfied with something so straightforwardly innocent. And indeed, if he said yes, he would probably find some way to be miserable. And if he married her and got his dream life, he would probably find some way to be miserable anyway.
Yeah.
And like he kind of knows that about himself, so that he doesn't propose to her. He kind of, and then when she does get married to someone else, that's when he knows he has to go back in and then like essentially try to have an illicit relationship with her, or a relationship which now can never be. He's just like there's something really weird and like nihilistic and cynical and strange about all of Mishima's novels. And so that's almost what Kierkegaard reminded me of. That character, his name is, I don't even know how to say his name. Would it be Kyoki or would it be Kiyowaki? Because Japanese doesn't generally go in for digraphs with vowels. Like if it's 2 vowels, they usually say both, and it's Kiyoaki. So I would almost say Kiyowaki, but I don't know. Kiyowaki and again Matsugae or Matsuge, I don't know, because it's Matsugae. That's the character's name, Kyoki Matsuge. He's just a jackass basically. And but anyway, like the rest of the series of novels is the because he dies as a result of his poor life choices. He dies in his early 20s, and his friend does all the right things, and he's very straight-laced, and he becomes a judge eventually, and he's Shigekuni Honda, I think is his name. And but he discovers at age 40 that his friend, who died at 20, has become reincarnated as another now 20-year-old young man. And I believe that novel is called, the first one is Spring Snow. The second one is, I want to say, Runaway Horses. And in Runaway Horses, there's like a young political firebrand who essentially does what Mishima died doing. He gets caught up in like some kind of political plot. and then he dies when he's 20, and then so Honda pursues. He looks for the reincarnation of him and a third person who's it's a young Thai woman, which is strange. It's sort of out of the pattern, but still just enough in the pattern as to be regarded as a plausible continuation or reincarnation. And then the fourth one is it's following the logic, but there's something about it where, oh man, like the fourth one, it kind of gives the lie to the fourth one is I'm barely remembering it correctly, but the fourth one is almost like the discovery that basically if it's this guy, then there never were any previous reincarnations, and there never was. And indeed, he returns to the abbot, the monastery where his friend died, and he asked the abbess a question about what happened those 60 years ago, and she answers him as if what he's talking about never happened. There never was such a man as Kyoki Matsuge. And so that's kind of like the discovery that the Sea of Fertility has no water and isn't fertile, or anyway, that was really long and rambling. I just remember that novel series. Why did I read it? I don't know. It's actually kind of cool. I like Yukio Mishima a lot, and he wrote other novels that I like a lot too. Actually, I can claim this. I've read every single Mishima novel that ever found its way into English translation. But yeah, no, but who is that guy? Nobody knows, and it's not important anyway. But
what's his name? Yukio
Mishima.
Yukio Nishima.
Mishima, like in Tekken, like Heihachi Mishima and Kazuya Mishima, like that name. But that wasn't his real name. His real name was Kimitake Hiraoka. This all comes from my atheist period. I didn't believe in God from like ages 16 to 28. But in my late teens, I read a lot of Japanese literature. So that's how I know about Mishima and a slew of other Japanese authors. Yeah, anyway, that's kind of long and rambling. And speaking of like talking too much, I should probably cut myself off. There's things I need to do, but I'm glad to meet you.
Yes.
It's nice to meet you. Are you on Bridges of Meaning?
No, not by. So, were you around when Joey was there?
Yes.
Okay, so I can message you, or Joey can message you. I kind of got a history with BOM, or I did. No hard feelings towards anyone.
A lot of people do. No, I mean, no, that's fine.
I got booted off the server like 2 years ago.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's fine. Like, I don't know. I mean, yeah. I'm wondering just whatever way we can connect. I suppose on this server, I'll try to be on here more.
Yeah, on Wilkins.
Yeah, and my podcast, I'm not even sure how to share it yet, or how I would share it with you. I had a podcast and I stopped it, and then I kind of reintroduced it, but kind of more like kind of cloaked and disguised and pseudonymous, and more kind of, it's now less meant as a platform to even theoretically reach people as it is just more, it's like sort of my my auditory journal where I can externally process my ideas to do theology. Because there's some way that I am an auditory thinker. Like like in some way I can't read. Like reality doesn't make sense to me as a succession of like lines of text on a page. It makes sense to me as like whether narrative or argument. It's lines of spoken language that really, that I kind of organize subject matter by, to the extent that I'm thinking about it linguistically at all. Sure. And so anyway, I find it useful to like pretend to have a podcast to discuss theological ideas as a way of helping me make sense of them more.
Sure.
And because then what you discover is that if you do that, then you can say in a few minutes what it took you a few hours to say in the previous episode, quote unquote. And that's really useful to have. And personally, like when people have to quote someone or they have to like find some place that it's written in text and they're not able to give a verbal explanation, in person as the occasion demands, then on some level, like as far as I'm concerned, they don't really know the subject. They don't really even have a claim to that knowledge. The knowledge has to be part of you and almost embodied in that sense. You at least have to be able to see it from enough different perspectives that you can explain it from different angles. But anyway, I'm just rambling about stuff. I'll find some way to share my podcast to you.
Yeah. My name on Jacob's Discord server, it's Angel Orange.
Angel Orange.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Well, I will see you later, and best of luck to you, and God bless you. It was very nice to meet you.
Yeah, man. God bless. No, great to meet you too.
All right. Take care. Let me
All
see
right,
if I can even figure out how to end this stream. If I leave the studio, it does not necessarily end the stream unless it ends whenever everyone leaves the stream. Presumably that. Okay.
Okay. We'll try
All right,
that.
I'll see you later.
All right. See you, Cal. All right. Hey, king of the stream, baby. No. All right. Bye, Jacob.